The key was the only thing she had left. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Nora Vance held it in her palm the way other 17-year-olds held car keys or house keys or the keys to college dorm rooms they were about to move into for the first time, with the particular weight of possibility of something about to begin. But those other keys came with people standing behind them. Parents, grandparents, someone who pressed the metal into your hand and said, "Here, this is yours now. You are ours now." Nora's key came from a shoebox. A shoebox that had been shoved into her arms at 7:30 in the morning by a woman named Denise Pollard, who managed the group home on Archer Street, and who had the specific brand of exhaustion that came not from cruelty, but from simply having processed too many children over too many years to feel any of them individually anymore. "You aged out last night," Denise had said. "I know it's early. There's a bus pass in there through the end of the month. Good luck." The door had closed before Nora finished pulling the shoebox flaps apart. Inside, folded around a rubber band that had gone stiff and brittle with age, was a letter she'd never seen before. A social services document dated the year she arrived, when she was 4 years old, noting that one personal item had been received with the child upon intake. One brass key, origin unknown. Item retained in file pending family contact. Family contact never came. The key was old. She could tell that much. The head of it was shaped like a small door, a rectangle with an arch at the top, the way children drew doors in pictures of houses they wished they lived in. Around the edges of the door shape ran an inscription so worn she had to tilt it under the morning light to read it. She read the words 3 times before she believed them. "For the one who comes after. The lock has been waiting." Nora stood on the sidewalk outside the group home with a shoebox under one arm and a bus pass in her pocket, and a key to something she did not understand, and she did not cry. She had learned a long time ago that crying was a thing you did when you believed someone might come. When you stopped believing that, the tears dried up too, and what replaced them was something harder and quieter and more useful. Something that looked, from the outside, like calm. She was not calm, but she was practiced at looking it. The first week after aging out, Nora slept on the floor of a girl named Priya's apartment. A girl she'd known from the group home 2 placements back, who was 19 now and working double shifts at a diner, and who said, "You can stay until the end of the month, but after that I can't promise anything," and who meant it kindly and kept her word. Nora spent those days doing 3 things. She applied for every job she could reach by bus. She sat in the public library on Haverford Avenue for as many hours as it was open because it was warm and no one asked her to buy anything. And she researched the key. She did not know where to start, so she started with the inscription. "For the one who comes after. The lock has been waiting." She typed it into search engines and got nothing useful. She photographed the key and ran it through image searches and found antique lock forums and collector communities and a rabbit hole of Victorian-era hardware that told her the key was old, possibly very old, possibly made in the late 1800s or early 1900s. A style associated with a particular type of cabinet lock manufactured in the northeastern United States during a window of about 30 years before the style was discontinued. That narrowed nothing. It was a key. It opened something. She had no idea what. What she had was time and a library card and the specific kind of determination that forms in people who have learned that no one is coming to explain things to them, so they had better figure it out themselves. She found the social services document buried in her file folder more carefully this time. The intake form from the year she arrived listed her as Nora Vance, age 4, brought in by a county officer following a welfare check at a residence. No parents listed. The field for guardian was blank. The field for emergency contact said unknown. But at the very bottom, in handwriting rather than typed text, someone had added a note. Child had key around neck on cord. Cord removed for safety. Key retained. Appears to be family item. Note for record. Child said, "That's Grandpa's. He said give it to me when I was big enough." Nora read that line until the words blurred. She had said that. She had been 4 years old and she had said that, and she did not remember saying it. And she did not remember a grandfather. And she did not remember anything before the first foster home, except shapes and colors and the smell of something that might have been wood smoke or pine or the particular scent of a house that was very old and very loved. She did not remember a man who had put a key around her neck and told her she would be big enough someday. But he had remembered her. He had made a plan. He had said give it to her when she's big enough, which meant he had known she was going somewhere, which meant he had known she was going to need it, which meant somewhere in the geography of her life there was a door that belonged to her and had been waiting, as the inscription said, all this time. She applied to 15 jobs that week. She got one call back from a cleaning company called Summit Service Solutions that contracted with commercial properties downtown and needed someone for overnight shifts, Monday through Saturday, 6 hours per shift, minimum wage, no benefits, start immediately. She said yes before the woman on the phone finished the sentence. The uniform was gray and the cart was heavy, and the buildings she cleaned were the kind of buildings she would never have entered through the front door. Office towers with lobby art that cost more than she would earn in a decade. Law firms with glass walls and leather chairs, and the specific hush of places where power lived quietly because it had nothing to prove. She pushed her mop through those silent spaces every night, and she looked at everything, and she touched nothing that wasn't hers to touch, and she thought about the key. She kept it on a new cord around her neck. She had bought the cord at a hardware store with $3 from her first paycheck, a ball chain cord, the same kind that held military dog tags, because it was the sturdiest cheap option and because she was not going to lose this. Whatever this was, she was not going to lose it. Her second week, she found the city archive. It was not glamorous. It was a room in the basement of the municipal building on Clement Street, staffed by a single archivist named Gerald who was somewhere between 60 and 80 and who wore the same cardigan every day Nora came in and who had the patient, distant quality of a man who had spent his professional life among documents and had found them more reliable than people. He did not ask why she was there. He showed her how the index system worked. He left her alone. She was looking for anything connected to the name Vance. It was not an uncommon name. The archive was full of Vances, property records and business licenses and tax documents going back to the city's founding, and most of them had nothing to do with her. But she was patient. She had learned patience the way you learned it in the group home, not as a virtue, but as survival, the understanding that wanting something faster than it could come only broke you, and you needed to stay whole. 3 weeks into her searches, on a Tuesday evening in November with rain hitting the basement windows in long diagonal sheets, she found it. A property record, filed 1987. Owner, Thomas Vance. Address, 14, Birch Hollow Road, Sutter County. Parcel number, legal description, assessed value. And at the bottom, under notes, typed in faded ink, structure on property of historical interest. Main house predates county incorporation. Key mechanism on lower storage room flagged by county inspector as non-standard. Recommend assessment for historical register. Key mechanism. Non-standard key mechanism. Nora's hands were very still on the document. She photographed it with her phone. She went back to the index and looked for anything else connected to Thomas Vance. She found a death record. He had died in 2001, which meant he had been dead for 23 years, which meant he had died when she was, if her math was right, not yet 1 year old, which meant she had never known him, which meant he had put a key around the neck of an infant daughter or granddaughter and trusted that she would survive long enough to use it. And then he had died. And then whatever family might have explained any of this had scattered or failed her, and she had ended up in a shoebox on a sidewalk with a bus pass and an old key and no context whatsoever. She sat with that for a long moment. Then she looked up Birch Hollow Road. It was a 2-hour bus ride from the city, out into the part of the county that the county had mostly forgotten about, where the roads went from paved to gravel, and the properties were large, and the addresses were the kind that only locals knew how to find. The last bus ran at 4 in the afternoon, and the first bus back ran at 8 in the morning, which meant that going out there was a day-long commitment, and she would have to miss a shift, which she could not afford to do, technically, but which she was going to do anyway, because there was a house on Birch Hollow Road with a non-standard key mechanism in the lower storage room, and she was carrying the key. She told herself it probably meant nothing. She told herself the property had likely been sold a dozen times since 1987. She told herself that showing up at someone else's house with a key she'd found in a shoebox was not a plan. It was a hope, and hopes were things she had learned to hold loosely because held too tightly they broke hands. She went anyway. On a Saturday, her one day off. She wore her cleanest clothes and put the key under her shirt and took the early bus before dawn. Birch Hollow Road found her more than she found it. She got off at the last stop, which was a gas station and a dollar store at a crossroads, and she asked the man behind the counter how to get to Birch Hollow Road. And he told her to go left at the water tower, and then straight for about a mile, and then look for the birch trees. You'll know them. They're the only white ones left out that way. Everything else got cut years back. She walked. It was November and cold, and the sky was the color of old pewter, flat and low and heavy with weather that had not yet decided what to be. The road was exactly as described. Gravel that crunched under her shoes and gave way to dirt in the low spots where water pooled and then froze in the night temperatures. The birch trees appeared exactly when he said they would, a stand of them on the left side of the road. White bark bright against the gray morning like something out of a book about places where magic was still possible. Behind them, set back from the road by a long track of overgrown grass that might once have been a driveway, was the house. She stopped walking. She had not known what she expected. She had told herself to expect nothing. But the house still hit her in a way she was not prepared for. Not because it was beautiful, though it had been once. She could see that in its bones, in the way it sat on the land with a particular settled quality, as though it had grown there rather than been built, but because of something she could not name and did not try to name, only felt. Standing on a gravel road in the gray morning with the birch trees at her back and the key against her sternum. It felt like recognition. The house was 2 stories, white clapboard that had gone gray and peeling in long curls, a wide porch that sagged at one corner where a support had given way, windows intact on the upper floor, but boarded on the lower with plywood that had warped and darkened with weather. The roof had a hole in it that she could see from the road, a dark gap near the chimney where something had given in and let the sky through. The yard was deep in brown grass and the tangle of things that grew when no one was tending them, wild rose canes and volunteer saplings, and the general beautiful disorder of land that had been left to its own devices. There was a rusted mailbox at the end of the track with letters she could just barely read. Vance. Nora stood there for a long time. She was 17 years old, and she had spent 13 years in a system that processed children like paperwork, moved them from file to file, placement to placement, and never once said to her, "You belong somewhere specific, you have a history, someone made a place for you and meant it." And here was a mailbox with her name on it. Here was a house with her name on it. Here was, possibly, a door with a lock that had been waiting 40 years. She walked up the track. The porch steps held her weight, barely. She tested each one before she put her foot down, moving to the side where the wood was more solid, and she reached the porch itself and crossed it to the front door and stood before it. The front door was padlocked from the outside, a heavy modern padlock that someone had added at some point, but it was not the original lock. She could see the original lock plate beneath it, old brass, tarnished nearly black, with a keyhole shaped like nothing she had ever seen before. It was shaped like a small door, a rectangle with an arch at the top. She took the key from around her neck. Her hands were shaking. She had not expected them to shake. She was not a person who shook. She pressed the key to the old keyhole, and it slid in as though it had never been anywhere else, as though the mechanism had been waiting in the particular tension of something that wants to turn and simply needed the right piece to do it. And she turned it, and she felt the tumblers move, one by one in sequence, deeper in the body of the lock than should have been possible for something this size. A long, patient series of clicks like a sentence being spoken slowly so she could understand every word. The door did not open. The padlock was still in place, but she had felt it unlock. She had felt every tumbler give way. Whatever was inside this house, she had just proven that the key was real, that the inheritance was real, that a man she had never known had put a key around her neck before she could walk and told someone to give it back to her when she was old enough, and he had not been wrong. She sat down on the porch in the gray morning, and she let the shaking happen, and no one was there to see it, and that was fine. She had been alone in everything that mattered for as long as she could remember. The difference was that now, for the first time, she was alone in something that had her name on it. She did not know yet what she was going to do. She did not know who owned the house now, or what legal rights she had, or whether the key meant anything beyond the emotional weight she was already carrying. She did not know that the house was the beginning of something so much larger than a house. She did not know about what was in the lower storage room, or about the people who would try to take it from her, or about the woman who would show up 3 weeks later with a briefcase and a legal claim and the particular cold certainty of someone who has been waiting a long time to collect. She knew only what she had, a key that fit, a name on a mailbox, and the long-practiced refusal to believe that things which belonged to her could be taken without a fight. She took photographs of everything: the mailbox, the door, the keyhole, the key inside the keyhole. She photographed the plywood windows and the caved roof section and the sagging porch corner and the birch trees at the end of the track and the mailbox again from further away, so you could see the whole property in the background. She was not sure why she was documenting everything. She did not yet know that documentation was going to be the most important thing she did. She did not know that there would come a day when she would stand in front of people who would insist this was not hers, and that she would need proof, layer by layer, that she had been here first, that she had known about this place before anyone else thought to look, that she had come in the cold with her key and her name and her inheritance. She walked back to the road as the first light snow began, tiny and dry and almost invisible against the pewter sky. She waited for the bus back to the city, and when it came she got on, and she sat in the back, and she held the key in both hands, and she thought about a man named Thomas Vance who had died in 2001 and who had, before he died, thought of her. She was going to find out what he had left her, whatever it took. The city archive was closed on Sundays. She went first thing Monday morning before her shift. Applications and asked Gerald if there were any additional records on the Vance property on Birch Hollow Road. He looked at her over his reading glasses with the measured assessment of someone who had been asked strange questions for 40 years and had learned to distinguish the strange questions that led somewhere from the ones that did not. Then he put down his cardigan and said, "Give me a few minutes," and disappeared into the back. He came back with a folder that was not in the index. "These were transferred here from the county assessor's office about 8 years ago," he said. When the assessor's office digitized, they boxed up anything that didn't fit the new system. Handwritten records, old deed supplements, that kind of thing. Nobody comes looking for them usually. Inside the folder was a deed supplement from 1962, handwritten on paper that had gone the color of old tea. The handwriting was careful and precise, the handwriting of a person who had been taught that written words were serious things and treated them accordingly. The deed recorded the establishment of a family trust, the Vance Family Preservation Trust, for the property at 14 Birch Hollow Road and all structures thereon, to be held in trust for lineal descendants of Thomas Vance in perpetuity, with the following specific provision. She read it twice. The lower storage room and all contents therein are specifically excluded from any sale, transfer, or division of the property, and shall remain the property of the lineal descendant who holds the original entry key, which was given into family keeping in 1887 and has remained so since. In the event of the death of the primary trust holder without clear succession, the key shall be held until the rightful heir presents themselves. The key had been in her family since 1887, 137 years. She asked Gerald what a lineal descendant meant in legal terms, and he told her it meant a direct bloodline descendant, child or grandchild or further down the line, and she asked him whether that kind of trust could still be legally valid after more than 60 years, and he said that was genuinely a question for a lawyer, not an archivist, but that he had seen stranger things hold up. She asked him if there was any record of who the current legal holder of the trust was. He looked through the folder and found a notation from 1989, the last time the trust had been reviewed, which listed Thomas Vance as the sole living lineal descendant, with the provision that upon his death the trust would pass to the next lineal descendant. That was her. If she could prove it. If the bloodline held. If the paperwork connected. She was 17 years old with $300 in her account and a job cleaning office buildings at night, and she needed a lawyer. She went to the library after the archive and used the computers to look up legal aid clinics in the county. She found one that served people in her income bracket and age range. It was open on Thursdays. The wait for an appointment was 6 weeks. She put her name on the list and marked the date on her phone. 6 weeks. She could wait 6 weeks. She had been waiting her whole life. What she could not do was let the house sit for 6 weeks without knowing more about it. She went back the following Saturday on the same early bus, and this time she brought tools she had borrowed from Summit Service Solutions, specifically a flashlight, a pry bar, and a bolt cutter, none of which she had permission to borrow, all of which she returned the following Monday. She cut the padlock with the bolt cutter, which was technically illegal, and which she told herself was not because her name was on the mailbox and the trust document said the key holder was the rightful owner of the lower storage room and all contents therein, and she was the key holder, and the key had already opened the original lock, and therefore she was accessing her own property. And she knew this was a thin argument, but it was the only argument she had, and she was going to live inside it until she could get a better one. The door swung open into darkness that smelled of old wood and cold air, and something underneath those things that she could not identify, something dry and faintly sweet, like paper that had been undisturbed for a very long time. She stood in the doorway with the flashlight and looked. The main floor of the house was gutted by weather and time. There was a living room with a collapsed ceiling section and plaster in drifts across the floorboards. A kitchen with the bones of old cabinetry and a cast-iron stove that had not been used in decades. A staircase that looked structurally sound, but that she tested every step of before she trusted it. 2 bedrooms upstairs that were dusty and cold and empty of everything except the wallpaper, which was extraordinary, blue and white, and still vibrant. Flowers she didn't know the names of, twining up the walls in patterns that someone had chosen carefully. Someone who had cared about this place. Someone who had lived here and loved it and chosen the wallpaper for the upstairs bedroom, and then died and left behind a key and a trust document and a granddaughter who didn't know any of it until she was 17. The lower storage room was accessed from a door at the back of the kitchen. It was the only door in the house besides the front that had the original lock mechanism, the same brass plate, the same arch-topped keyhole. She slid the key in. The same series of clicks, one by one, patient and sequential, the lock giving way to the thing that had always belonged in it. The door opened. She pointed the flashlight inside, and everything she thought she understood about what her life was going to be changed in a single breath. It was a room, roughly 12 feet by 15, with stone walls and a low ceiling and a floor of wide wooden planks that had been sealed with something that kept them from the damp and the rot that had touched everything else in the house. And it was full, not cluttered, not haphazardly full, but deliberately, carefully, intentionally full. Shelving along all 4 walls, floor to ceiling, built from the same old wood as everything else but solid, well-jointed, the work of someone who understood that what went on these shelves needed to stay there safely. On the shelves, instruments. Musical instruments, dozens of them, in cases and out of cases, in varying states of preservation. Violins, she could see that immediately, 5 or 6 of them in cases, but also things she didn't know the names of. A viola, she thought, and a cello, and something that might have been a lute, and a row of smaller instruments in individual mounts that looked handmade. Beside them, taking up the middle section of shelving, were flat cases that she recognized from her time in the library, the kind of cases used to store documents or artwork lying flat. And on the lowest shelves, in climate-sealed containers that someone had clearly added long after the original shelving was built, containers with small gauges on the front that she did not understand, but that had clearly been put there to monitor something. She stepped inside. The air was different in here. Drier. Still, the same consistent temperature as the outside would have been in fall and winter, but stable, maintained by something she could not see. She looked up and found a small vent near the ceiling that was connected to what appeared to be a rudimentary climate control mechanism, old and hand-built but functional, the kind of thing that someone with ingenuity and a specific purpose had constructed because nothing commercial existed yet that would do what they needed. Someone had built a preservation room. In 1887, or close enough to it, someone had built a preservation room in the basement of a house on a gravel road in the middle of nowhere, and they had filled it with instruments and documents and sealed the door with a lock that required a specific key, and they had kept that key in the family for 137 years. And now the key was around the neck of a 17-year-old girl who had spent 13 years in the foster care system and who was standing in a flashlight beam, staring at something she was not remotely equipped to evaluate. She did not touch anything. She took photographs of everything. She left and locked the door and walked back to the road in the thin November light and caught the bus back to the city and sat in the library until it closed, looking up everything she could find about antique musical instruments and their value and who assessed them and what made them worth something and what a Stradivari was and why that word kept appearing in every article she read about rare violins and whether it was possible that something like that could exist in a house that no one had entered in decades. She did not sleep that night. She lay on Priya's floor, and she thought about the inscription on the key. For the one who comes after. The lock has been waiting. It had been waiting 40 years, they would later tell her. since the last person with a key to that room had entered it. 40 years of waiting, in a room that had been built to wait, by people who understood that the most important things sometimes needed to outlast the people who loved them most. She did not know that yet. She did not know most of what she was going to find out. She knew that something extraordinary was in that room, and that the key around her neck was the only reason she had access to it, and that she was 17 and alone and without resources, but that she had, her whole life, been 17 and alone and without resources, and she had learned something important about that condition. It made you careful. It made you thorough. It made you document everything and trust slowly and move precisely and never assume that good things lasted unless you protected them. She was going to protect this. By the end of the month, she was sleeping on a cot in the back room of a church shelter that allowed young adults up to age 21, which was not comfortable, but which was safer than Priya's floor and less of an imposition. She was working her overnight shifts 6 nights a week and spending her days at the archive and the library, and, twice more, at the house on Birch Hollow Road, taking more photographs and more notes, and teaching herself the vocabulary of the things in that room, so that when the time came to talk to someone who knew more than she did, she would not sound like what she was, which was a girl who had fallen into something far beyond her experience. She had made a list of what she thought she could see in the room. 7 string instruments in cases, 2 string instruments on mounts without cases, 11 instruments of various types she had not yet identified, 46 flat storage cases in the middle shelving section, 12 climate-sealed containers on the lower shelves, 1 wooden trunk, padlocked, in the far left corner that she had not yet tried the key on but intended to. She had looked up antique instrument appraisers. There was one in the city, a man named Burton Hale who operated out of a shop on the east side, and who had a website that described him as a certified appraiser of historical musical instruments with 40 years of experience. She had called and been told that an assessment of an estate collection would start at $500 for an initial evaluation. She had $532 in her account. She could do this. If the evaluation told her there was something real here, something valuable enough to justify the legal fight that was coming, because she was beginning to understand that a fight was coming, she could then use that evaluation to get the legal aid clinic to take her case seriously. She called back and made the appointment. She was going to need help. She knew that. She was 17, and the system had taught her that asking for help was dangerous because it made you dependent on people who could leave, but she was also learning, slowly and with some pain, that some things were too large to carry alone. She needed a lawyer and an appraiser and possibly someone who understood historical documents, and she had access to none of these things except through the careful and patient building of one connection at a time. She thought of Thomas Vance, a man who had died before she could walk, who had nonetheless made provisions for her, who had nonetheless thought of her, who had nonetheless built a room and filled it with things he meant her to have, and locked the door and put the key around her neck. He had known he would not be there to explain. He had done the best he could across whatever distance separated them. He had left her a starting point. She was working from his starting point. 3 weeks after her first visit to Birch Hollow Road, she was in the archive pulling more records when Gerald looked up from his cardigan and said, "There was someone else asking about the Vance property." She went very still. "When?" "This morning, before you came in. A woman. Lawyer type, I think. Professional. She was asking about the property records and the trust documentation. I told her the same things I'd tell anyone, that the records were available to the public." Did she give a name? Gerald thought. She left a card. He looked in the small dish he kept on the corner of his desk and found it and held it out. Said she might have further questions. The card read, Marlowe Sinclair, Esquire. Sinclair and Beach Property Law. Specializing in estate recovery and trust dissolution. Trust dissolution. Nora held the card for a moment. Then she put it in her pocket. "Thank you, Gerald," she said. She walked out of the archive and into the cold and stood on the sidewalk and understood that the 40 years of waiting were over, and not only for her. Someone else had been looking for the Vance property. Someone else knew about the trust. Someone else had lawyers and was asking about dissolution, which meant someone else wanted what was in that room and had perhaps been waiting for the right moment to come for it, and the right moment was apparently now. While the only person who held the key was 17 years old and sleeping on a church shelter cot, and had no lawyer and no money and no family and nothing but a key and a name on a mailbox and the long-practiced refusal to let things that belonged to her be taken without a fight. She pulled out her phone and called the legal aid clinic. The appointment was in 4 weeks. She said she understood there might be a situation that was moving faster than that and asked if there was any way to be moved up the list. The woman on the phone said she was sorry. The wait list was the wait list, and Nora said she understood and thank you and hung up. She stood on the sidewalk in the cold. Then she did something she had never done in her life. She called the number on Marlo Sinclair's business card. It rang 3 times, and a professional voice answered. Sinclair and Beach. This is Nora Vance, Nora said. I understand you've been asking about my property. A pause. A longer pause than professional courtesy required. Ms. Vance, said the voice, with a quality she recognized immediately because she had heard it before from teachers who did not expect her to speak up, from caseworkers who did not expect her to push back, from managers who did not expect her to know her rights. It was the quality of someone being recalculated. I was not aware there was a Ms. Vance, the voice said. There is, Nora said. I have the key. I have been in the room. I have documentation. If your client has a claim to the Vance property or its contents, I would like to hear it directly. Another pause. I'll need to speak with my client, the voice said. I'll call you back. The voice called back 2 hours later and said that a meeting could be arranged and that Marlo Sinclair herself would attend, and that it would be helpful if Nora brought any documentation she had. Nora said she would think about it. She hung up and sat very still for a moment and thought about what Thomas Vance had done, a man who had known he was running out of time and had done the best he could anyway, building a room, locking a door, putting a key around a baby's neck, and trusting the future to carry it forward. She had carried it forward. She was here. Whatever came next, she was going to meet it with every piece of documentation she had and the particular steadiness of someone who had learned to be their own beginning. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The meeting was set for the following Thursday in an office building downtown that Nora walked past every other night pushing a cleaning cart, and she took strange satisfaction in entering it through the front door in her own clothes rather than through the service entrance in her gray uniform. She wore the same things she'd worn to the legal aid clinic inquiry, the cleanest version of what she had, which was not much, but which she wore with the specific posture of someone who understood that how you carried yourself mattered in rooms designed to make you feel small. Marlo Sinclair was 40-something, precise, with close-cropped silver hair and glasses that probably cost more than Nora's monthly salary, and the particular measured quality of a person who was very good at not showing what she was thinking. She sat across a conference table with a leather portfolio open in front of her and a younger associate beside her who took notes and said nothing. Across from them, Nora sat alone. I appreciate you coming in, Sinclair said. Her voice was neutral in a way that was itself a kind of statement. I want to be direct with you. My client has a significant interest in the Vance estate, and a legal claim that we believe supersedes any interest you may have. Who is your client? Nora said. Sinclair glanced at her associate. At this stage, I'd prefer to focus on the documentary record. You mentioned you have the key. I have the key. And you've accessed the property. I have. The property has been in a state of legal ambiguity since Thomas Vance's death in 2001. There was no clear succession identified at that time. My client has been working through the appropriate channels to establish a claim and has been doing so for several years. Nora kept her face still. Through what channels? The county probate process. Sinclair folded her hands. Mr. Vance died intestate with respect to the property. There was no will on record. The trust document from 1962 identifies the key holder as the rightful inheritor of the lower storage room and its contents, but for the past 23 years, there has been no identified key holder. My client has been the primary occupant of the property since 2004 and has a claim of adverse possession that we believe is legally defensible. Nora processed this. Someone has been living there. Intermittently. The property has not been maintained, as you've no doubt seen. But my client has been present on the property regularly enough to establish the required elements. There's a padlock on the front door. My client placed that lock. On my property. Sinclair's composure rippled, slightly, barely, but Nora had learned to read very small signals. Ms. Vance, I want to be clear. I'm not here to threaten you. I'm here because my client became aware that someone had accessed the property and the lower storage room, and he felt it was important to establish the situation before it became more complicated. The client was a man. What does he want? Nora said. He would like the contents of the lower storage room, not the property. He's willing to transfer the deed to the main house and the land. He has no interest in those. He's specifically interested in the contents of the storage room. Nora thought about the shelves, the cases, the instruments, the flat storage containers, the trunk. Has he been in the room? She said. A pause. Not successfully. The lock mechanism is original and the key was not available to him. He had tried to get in. He had been trying to get in for 20 years, possibly longer, and had not been able to because the lock was waiting for her, specifically, and he didn't have what she had. What's his name? She said again. Sinclair considered. His name is Raymond Vance. A Vance. Another Vance. How is he related to Thomas Vance? Nora said. He is Thomas Vance's son. She had a great-uncle. Or she had a man who claimed to be her great-uncle, who had been trying to get into a locked room for 20 years, who had put a padlock on the front door of a house where his name was on the mailbox, but where the room that mattered had been waiting for someone else. I'd like to meet him, Nora said. Sinclair looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who had not predicted this. I can arrange that. I'd also like time to review the trust documentation with my own legal counsel before any decisions are made about the contents. Of course. A beat. Who is your legal counsel? Nora had the legal aid clinic appointment in 3 weeks and a name on a wait list and nothing else. She looked at Marlo Sinclair across the conference table and said, I'm not at liberty to share that information at this stage. Sinclair nodded slowly. Understood. We'll set up the meeting with Mr. Vance. In the meantime, I would ask that you not remove anything from the property. I haven't removed anything, Nora said. I documented what's there. I haven't touched anything. Good. Sinclair closed her portfolio. Ms. Vance, I want you to understand that my client is prepared to be reasonable. He's not interested in prolonged litigation. He has a genuine family connection to this property and the items inside, and he believes there's a resolution that can work for everyone. Nora stood. I'll be in touch after I've spoken with my counsel. She walked out through the lobby and through the revolving door and into the cold street and went directly to the library, where she sat at a computer for 3 hours reading everything she could find about adverse possession law and family trusts and estate claims and the legal definition of lineal descendant and what it meant to die intestate and what happened to a trust when no successor was named and whether a key could be considered legal evidence of inheritance. She filled 4 pages of a legal pad with notes. She had bought the legal pad with her own money. She had bought the pen with her own money. She was 17 years old, and she was building a legal education one afternoon at a time, and she was not going to let Raymond Vance walk away with what was in that room. Because she had looked up what was in rooms like that one. She had spent days looking it up. And she understood now, with the specific precision of someone who had nothing but time and a library card and determination, that what Thomas Aldous Vance had locked in that room and left for her was not just instruments. It was not just documents. It was a collection, carefully assembled over the better part of a century, of things whose value could not be tallied in any straightforward way. Things that scholars and institutions and collectors had been looking for. Things that had been declared lost or destroyed or simply gone from the historical record. Things that, if she was right, and she believed she was right, were worth far more than any reasonable person would assume, was sitting in a stone room on a gravel road at the end of a birch-lined track in the middle of a county that had mostly forgotten the property existed. And Raymond Vance, whoever he was, had known that. He had known that for 20 years. He had put a padlock on the door and waited, and when the waiting became intolerable, he had hired a lawyer. But she had the key. She had always had the key. She just hadn't known it until now. She pressed her hand against her sternum where the key rested under her shirt, and she thought about Thomas Vance putting it there, around the neck of a baby, trusting the future, trusting her, and she made him a promise that she could not say out loud because she was in a library and there were other people around. She was going to be big enough. She was going to be exactly big enough for what he had left her. Raymond Vance was not what she had expected, which was itself a lesson she kept having to relearn, that people rarely were. She had imagined someone cold and polished, someone who matched the lawyer and the letterhead and the precise language of adverse possession and trust dissolution. She had prepared herself for a man in an expensive suit who looked at her the way people in expensive suits tended to look at her, which was to say through her, their eyes landing somewhere just past her face, as though she were a piece of furniture that had been placed inconveniently in their path. Raymond Vance was 71 years old, and he arrived at Marlowe Sinclair's conference room in work pants and a flannel shirt with a collar that had been pressed, but not recently. And he walked with the slight forward lean of a man whose back had been giving him trouble for years. And when he saw Nora sitting alone at the conference table, he stopped in the doorway and looked at her with an expression she could not immediately read. Then he said, quietly, almost to himself, "You've got his eyes." Nora did not respond. He sat down across from her. Sinclair sat to his right, portfolio open, pen ready. The associate was there again, still silent, still taking notes. "I'm told you have the key," Raymond said. "I do. Can I see it?" She considered. Then she reached under her collar and pulled the key out and held it up by the cord without taking it off. The brass caught the office lighting and threw it back, dull and amber. Raymond Vance looked at it for a long time. Something moved across his face that she did not have a name for. Something that was not greed or calculation, or at least was not only those things. "He made that cord himself," Raymond said. "The first one. The original cord was braided leather. He made it from a saddle strap. I remember watching him do it when I was maybe 8 years old. He sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours getting the braid right." He paused. "You've got a different cord." "The original was removed when I entered foster care," Nora said. "For safety reasons. I replaced it." Raymond's jaw tightened. "You were in foster care. From age 4. Thomas didn't know that. He couldn't have known." He looked at his hands on the table. They were large hands, the hands of someone who had done physical work, scarred at the knuckles and thick at the joints. He died believing the family would hold together. He was wrong about that. Nora waited. She had learned that waiting was often more productive than speaking. "My father and I were estranged," Raymond said. "Had been since I was 32. We disagreed about the property, about what should happen to it, about almost everything. When he died, I wasn't told immediately. By the time I found out, the county had already reviewed the estate and found no will. The trust document existed, but the key was gone. Social services had it filed somewhere, and no one thought to connect the key in a child's intake file to a property trust in a county archive." "No one looked," Nora said. "No one looked," he agreed. She studied him. He was telling the truth, or at least he believed he was telling the truth, which was not always the same thing, but was sometimes close enough to matter. There was grief in him, old grief that had calcified into something that looked from the outside like stubbornness. "What's in the room?" she said. Raymond glanced at Sinclair. Sinclair's face was professionally neutral. He looked back at Nora. "You've been in there. I've seen what's there. I haven't identified it. I need an appraiser." "I know what's in there," Raymond said. "I grew up hearing about it. My father talked about it the way other fathers talked about religion, like it was sacred, like it was a responsibility that had been passed to him and that he was passing to me, except I didn't want it." He stopped. "I was 32 and stupid, and I thought the responsibility was a burden and the room was a liability, and the whole thing was my father's obsession with a dead history that had nothing to do with who I wanted to be." He was quiet for a moment. "I was wrong," he said. "I spent the next 40 years understanding how wrong I was. But by then the key was gone and my father was dead, and I didn't know where to start." Nora thought about Thomas Vance putting a key around a baby's neck, trusting the future because the present had failed him. "What is in the room?" she said again. Raymond Vance looked at her steadily. "The Vance collection," he said, as though that answered it, as though the name itself was enough. Then, when she didn't react, he added, "My great-grandfather, Clement Vance, was a luthier. Do you know what that is?" "Someone who makes and restores stringed instruments." A flicker of something crossed his face. Surprise, perhaps, at her knowing. He was the best in the region, possibly the best in the country for a period. He trained in Europe, in Cremona, in the workshops there, and he came back in 1882 and set up his shop in the city and then moved his operation to the house on Birch Hollow Road in 1887. He worked there until 1931, 44 years. Cremona. She had looked up Cremona. It was the city in Italy where the greatest violin makers in history had worked, where Stradivari had worked, where Guarneri had worked. In Cremona, Raymond continued, he trained under a man named Enzo Marchetti. Marchetti was not famous. He was not Stradivari. But he was the student of a man who was the student of a man who had worked alongside the great makers. The lineage was there. The craft was there. He paused. Clement came home with more than a training. He came home with instruments. Some he made. Some he was given in payment for restoration work he did in Europe. Some he acquired over the following decades when the estates of old families were dissolved and no one else recognized what they were looking at. Nora was very still. The room holds 40 years of his work and 30 more of my grandfather's and 20 of my father's, Raymond said. 3 generations of acquisition and restoration and preservation. My father built the climate control system himself in 1971. He taught himself everything he needed to know about conservation. He corresponded with museum curators anonymously because he didn't want anyone to know what he had. He was afraid of what would happen if people knew. Why? Nora said. Raymond's eyes were tired. Because some of what Clement brought back from Europe was not cleanly documented. The acquisitions were not illegal by the standards of the time. But by modern standards, by the standards of provenance research that institutions apply now, some of it would be complicated. My father spent years going through everything, documenting what he could, tracing what he could trace, and by the end of his life he believed everything in that room was clean. But he didn't trust that everyone would see it that way. And he didn't trust lawyers. He trusted the key. He trusted the family. He trusted me, Nora said. He put the key around my neck before I could walk. Raymond was quiet for a moment. You're my niece, he said finally. Your mother was my daughter. She died when you were 3. I didn't know about you. She and I were not close by then, and I didn't know she'd had a child, and by the time I found out, the county had already processed you through the system, and you were gone, and I couldn't find you. The room was very quiet. Nora did not let herself feel anything about that statement. Not in this room, not in front of these people. She filed it away, carefully, the way she filed everything that mattered too much to look at directly. Then you have a family claim to the property, she said, her voice level. I have a claim. Yes. But you don't have the key. Raymond held her gaze. No. And the trust document specifies that the contents of the lower storage room belong to the key holder. It does. So whatever your claim to the property itself, the room and everything in it is mine. Sinclair shifted slightly. Ms. Vance, the legal situation is more nuanced than, I understand it may be contested, Nora said. I have counsel reviewing the trust documentation. She did not have counsel. She had a wait list. I'm not here to agree to anything today. I'm here to understand who I'm dealing with and what they want. Raymond looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something she had not expected. You're like him, he said. Like Thomas. The way you hold yourself. The way you think. He shook his head slowly. He would have been so damn relieved to know you existed. She did not respond to that. She could not. What does your client want? She asked Sinclair, because she needed to get the conversation back to something she could manage. Shared stewardship, Sinclair said. Mr. Vance is not looking for sole control of the collection. He's looking for a formal arrangement that recognizes his family connection and ensures the collection is handled appropriately. Handled how? Assessed, documented, and placed with an appropriate institution. Sold, Nora said. Donated or sold, depending on what the assessment reveals. She thought about the room, the flat storage cases, the sealed containers, the trunk. I'm going to have the collection independently assessed, she said, before any decisions are made. That seems reasonable, Sinclair said, with the tone of someone being reasonable as a strategy. We can, independently, Nora said. My choice of appraiser. No one present from your side. When the assessment is complete, I'll share the results and we can discuss next steps. Sinclair looked at Raymond. Something passed between them, a calculation. We can agree to that, Raymond said. Within a reasonable time frame. 3 weeks, Nora said. 3 weeks, he agreed. She stood. She was 17 years old in a conference room with a lawyer and a great-uncle she had not known existed, and she had just negotiated the terms of access to something she did not fully understand yet, something she believed was extraordinary, something she was going to protect until she knew exactly what it was and exactly what she had the right to do with it. She took the elevator down alone and walked out through the lobby and stood on the cold sidewalk and breathed. 3 weeks. She had 3 weeks to get Burton Hale into that room and understand what she was holding and figure out what it meant. She called him from the bus on the way back to the shelter. He had one cancellation. He could come Saturday. She said yes. She said, thank you. She said, "I'll send you the address." Then she sat back and watched the city go past outside the window and thought about a man named Clement Vance who had trained in Cremona in 1882 and come home with instruments that no one else had recognized and built a room to keep them in and told his son, and his son had told his son, and his son had told no one because he was estranged, and by the time he wanted to fix it, there was no one left to tell except a baby. And the baby was her. She was going to be worthy of that. She did not know yet what that meant practically or legally or financially. She knew it the way she knew the key fit the lock, with the specific certainty of recognition. Burton Hale arrived at Birch Hollow Road at 10 in the morning in a truck that was older than he probably preferred, and that was filled, she could see through the windows, with cases and equipment and the general accumulated material of someone who had spent 4 decades doing careful work in the field. He was 63, solidly built, with the kind of deliberate movements that came from years of handling things that could not be replaced. He wore a vest with many pockets, all of them apparently in use. He looked at the house for a moment before he got out of the truck. Then he looked at Nora, who was waiting on the porch in her coat with her flashlight and her legal pad and the key around her neck. "You're younger than I expected," he said. Not unkindly. "Everyone says that," she said. "Come in." She had opened both locks, the padlock which still technically belonged to Raymond and which she had cut with borrowed bolt cutters again, and the original lock which yielded to the key with its now familiar patient sequence of clicks, and she led Burton through the main floor of the house, which he examined with the lateral attention of someone cataloging damage without stopping to mourn it, and then into the kitchen and to the door of the lower storage room. She opened it. She stepped back. She let him look. He stood in the doorway for so long that she began to count the seconds. At 47, he said, "Who built the climate control?" "The previous owner, Thomas Vance, in 1971. By hand." Apparently. Burton stepped inside. He moved slowly, not touching anything, just looking, his eyes moving from shelf to shelf in the methodical sweep of a person reading something important and not wanting to miss a word. He crouched in front of the instrument cases on the lower shelves. He stood and examined the flat storage cases. He walked to the sealed containers and looked at the gauges on the fronts of them and made a sound that was not quite a word. Then he turned around and looked at Nora. "Do you know what you have here?" he said. "I'm beginning to," she said. "No," he said carefully. "I don't think you do yet. I don't think I do yet." He turned back to the shelves. "May I open one of the instrument cases?" "Yes." Carefully. He gave her a brief look that said he had been doing this carefully for 40 years and did not need to be reminded. And then he opened the nearest case. Inside, nested in silk that had aged to a deep cream, was a violin. She had looked at photographs of violins for days. She knew the general shape, the proportions, the way the varnish could tell you something about age and origin. She was not an expert. She was not even an informed amateur. But she could see, standing in the doorway of a stone room in November, that this violin was old, and that it was beautiful in the way that things made by hands that knew exactly what they were doing were beautiful, with a depth to the wood and a clarity to the varnish that was not decoration but information. That was the material itself speaking about where it came from and who had understood it. Burton did not touch it with his hands. He used a small mounted light to illuminate the interior through the F-holes, and he bent close, and he was quiet for a long time. Then he straightened and looked at her, and she could not read his expression exactly, but she could read the set of his shoulders, which told her something had shifted in his understanding of what he was standing in front of. "There's a label," he said. "Inside. These things can be reproduced. I want to be clear about that, and a label alone means nothing without full authentication. But the label, combined with the varnish color, the wood grain, the construction details I can see from here, the neck angle, the cutting of the F-holes." He stopped. He made the not quite a word sound again. "I need to do a full assessment. I need to bring more equipment. I'm going to need at least 3 days in here." "What does the label say?" Nora said. He looked at her steadily. "Antonius Stradivarius Cremonensis, 1716. The room was very quiet. 1716, she said. One of the peak years. The golden period. If this is authentic, and I am not saying yet that it is, I am saying if, the value would be." He stopped. Started again. "There was a Stradivarius sold at auction in 2011 for $15.9 million. There was another in 2014 for 15.7. The market has moved considerably since then." Nora was leaning against the doorframe. She was not sure when that had happened. There are 7 cases on those shelves, she said. Burton looked at the shelves. Then he looked back at her. Yes, he said. There are. She could see him doing the math she was also doing. The impossible math. The math that kept coming out to a number that did not feel real. And the flat storage cases, she said. I haven't opened those yet. The trunk. Not that either. The sealed containers. Burton Hale sat down on the floor of the storage room. He did not seem to notice he had done it. He sat cross-legged on the sealed wooden planks among the shelves and the cases and the instruments that might be worth more than anything Nora had ever stood near in her life, and he looked at his hands for a moment. Then he looked up at her. How old are you? 17. And this is yours. The trust document says the room and contents belong to the key holder. I have the key. Do you have a lawyer? I'm working on that. He nodded slowly. Get one fast, he said. Because when word gets out about what's in this room, and it will get out, you are going to need significant legal protection. Tell me what you think the flat cases might be, she said. Burton stood up from the floor, brushing dust from his pants with the automatic gesture of someone returning to professionalism after a moment of being simply human. He crossed to the middle shelving and examined the flat storage cases without touching them. The construction of these cases is mid to late 19th century. The materials are consistent with professional document storage of that period. Given what I'm seeing with the instruments, and given the history you've described about Clement Vance training in Cremona and working with European estates. He paused. Sheet music, possibly manuscripts, letters, correspondence, documentation of the instruments' histories, if we're lucky, which would make authentication significantly more straightforward. And the sealed containers. More recent. 1960s or 70s storage, probably your Thomas Vance's editions. Could be anything he felt needed better preservation than the existing conditions provided. She thought about Thomas Vance teaching himself conservation, corresponding anonymously with museum curators, making a climate control system by hand because he understood what he was protecting and he was not going to let it deteriorate on his watch. I'll need 3 days, Burton said again. I need to bring a colleague. He works in document authentication, manuscripts primarily. Between the two of us, we can give you a preliminary assessment that will at least establish the scope of what we're looking at. I have 3 weeks before a meeting with the opposing party, Nora said. That's enough time. Barely. What will the assessment cost? He looked at her. The look contained a recognition of her situation that was more generous than pity. We'll discuss that after, he said. I need to see what we're dealing with first. She nodded. Come back Wednesday. Bring your colleague. I'll have the room accessible. He was already making notes on a small pad he had produced from one of his vest pockets. He did not look up when he said, What's your name? Your full name? Nora Vance. Nora Vance. He wrote it down. Do you understand that if even one of these instruments is what the label suggests, what you are standing in is one of the most significant private collections in the country? She looked at the shelves, at the cases and the flat containers, and the trunk in the corner, at the climate control system that Thomas Vance had built by hand in 1971 because he understood that some things needed to be protected even when no one was watching. I'm starting to, she said. The 3 days Burton Hale spent in the room with his colleague, a man named Dr. Priya Anand, who drove up from the city with 3 bags of equipment and who shook Nora's hand at the door with the specific gravity of someone who understood they were about to see something unusual, were the longest 3 days of Nora's life. She stayed out of the room while they worked. She did not have the patience of someone who could wait easily, but she had the discipline of someone who had learned that interfering with careful work made it take longer and sometimes made it wrong. She sat on the porch in the cold and drank coffee from a thermos she had bought with 2 weeks of careful saving, and she watched the birch trees at the end of the track, and she thought. She thought about Raymond Vance and his large scarred hands and the grief he had been carrying for 40 years and the way he had said, You've got his eyes, as though that were a fact he was glad to know even though it complicated everything. She thought about Marlowe Sinclair and her portfolio and her language of dissolution and shared stewardship and the specific precision of a person who had been paid to advocate for a particular outcome. She thought about the legal aid clinic and her appointment still 2 weeks away and whether 2 weeks was going to be fast enough. On the second afternoon, Dr. Anand came out of the room and sat beside her on the porch steps without speaking for a moment. He was somewhere in his 50s, small and precise, with the kind of stillness that came from years of spending time with things that deserved attention. "I need to ask you something," he said. "Go ahead. How much do you know about what's in the flat cases?" "Nothing specific." Burton said, "Possibly manuscripts, sheet music, correspondence." Dr. Anand was quiet for a moment. "We've opened 11 of them. We have not opened all 46. But in the 11 we've opened, we've found." He stopped and started again with the care of someone, choosing their words because the words needed to be accurate. "There is a collection of correspondence in there. Letters. Some of them are letters between Clement Vance and the estates he worked with in Europe. Some are from the makers themselves. Not Stradivari, he died in 1737, but from individuals in the lineage of the workshops. Letters about instruments, about techniques, about specific pieces. Letters that, if authenticated, would be of enormous historical value to musicologists and instrument historians." Nora waited. "And there is something else," Dr. Anand said. "In the 5th case we opened. I want to be careful because I am not making a definitive claim. I need more time with it, and I need to consult with colleagues at the university. But there is a manuscript in that case that I believe, based on what I can see without full analysis, may be an original composition. Handwritten. Late 18th century, based on the paper and the ink and the notation style." "Whose composition?" Nora said. Dr. Anand looked at her. "The notation style is consistent with work from the late classical period. The handwriting on the cover page is in a script I recognize from facsimiles I have studied extensively." He paused. "I want to be very clear that I am not making a definitive identification. The risk of being wrong about something like this is substantial." "I understand," she said. "Tell me." The cover page inscription reads, in German, "Für Violin allein, unvollendet," which translates to, "For violin alone, unfinished." He stopped. "The hand is consistent with Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart's documented handwriting." The birch trees moved in the wind. One of their white branches creaked. "An unfinished Mozart manuscript," Nora said. "A possible unfinished Mozart manuscript. In a collection that also contains what may be a 1716 Stradivarius violin." Dr. Anand looked at his hands. "I have been doing this work for 27 years. I have never been in a room like this." Nora breathed slowly. She breathed the way she had learned to breathe in moments of crisis, deliberately, taking the air all the way down, holding it, letting it back out. "How long do you need to finish the assessment?" she said. "One more full day? Possibly 2 for the trunk, depending on what's inside." The sealed containers on the lower shelves Burton has already opened. They contain additional documents and 3 more instrument components, pieces rather than complete instruments, bridges and tailpieces, and fitting components that are consistent with the period of the other instruments. "So there's more. There is likely considerably more than what we've identified," Dr. Anand said. "I want to complete the assessment before we discuss scope." "But Nora." He paused. "I need to ask you something, and I ask it with respect, not judgment." "Ask. Do you have legal representation?" "I'm working on it." He shook his head slightly. "You need to stop working on it and get it done. Today, if possible. What is in that room is going to generate interest the moment anyone outside this group knows about it. And Raymond Vance's lawyer already knows you've brought in an appraiser. They will be watching." "I know. The trust document protects you. The key protects you. But you are 17, and you have no family and no resources, and the person on the other side of this has money and a lawyer and 40 years of wanting what's in that room. You need someone in your corner who knows how to fight." She thought about what fighting had cost her over 17 years. How much of it she had done alone. How many rooms she had been in where she was the only person who was there for her. "I'll make some calls," she said. He nodded and went back inside. She made calls. She called the legal aid clinic and said she had an emergency situation and described it in the plainest possible terms. That she had inherited a property with a trust document naming her as the key holder, and that the collection inside was potentially worth a very significant sum, and that she had 3 weeks before a meeting with the opposing party who had retained legal counsel and who had been trying to access this property for 20 years. The woman on the phone was quiet for a moment. Then she said she would speak to their estate litigation specialist and call back. She called back in 2 hours. The estate litigation specialist, whose name was Fiona Marsh, could see Nora on Friday. Nora went on Friday. Fiona Marsh was 40-something, brisk, with the focused energy of someone who dealt with too many cases and had learned to move fast and waste nothing. She read the trust document twice. She read Nora's notes from the archive. She looked at the photographs Nora had taken of the room, of the instruments, of the flat storage cases, of the climate control system. She listened to Nora's account of the meeting with Marlowe Sinclair and Raymond Vance without interrupting. Then she sat back. "The trust document is valid," she said. "Unusual, but valid. The language is clear. The key holder controls the lower storage room and all contents. Raymond Vance's adverse possession claim is weak because the room itself was never occupied. He never had access to it, and adverse possession requires actual exclusive possession of the disputed property. His claim to the main house and land might hold up. His claim to the room will not." "He has a family connection," Nora said. "So do you. You're his niece. If you can establish the bloodline, which the foster care records should help do, you're the lineal descendant named in the trust. He is not a lineal descendant of Thomas Vance. He is Thomas Vance's son, which makes him a descendant of an earlier trustee, not of the trustee who locked the room and held the key." Nora processed this. "He's one generation up. The trust specifies lineal descent from Thomas. Raymond is Thomas's child. You're Thomas's grandchild through Raymond's daughter. The trust language passes to descendants, not ascendants. Raymond's claim as Thomas's son is actually weaker than your claim as Thomas's granddaughter." "He doesn't know that." Fiona smiled briefly. "His lawyer probably does by now, which may be why they're proposing shared stewardship rather than sole ownership." She leaned forward. "Here's what I want you to understand. The value of what's in that room is going to become public knowledge very soon, the moment Burton Hale files his preliminary assessment, and that's going to change the dynamic significantly. Right now, Raymond Vance wants what's in the room. When the numbers come out, other people are going to want what's in the room too." "What other people?" "Institutions, collectors, governments, potentially, depending on provenance. If there are questions about how items were acquired, and you mentioned that Clement Vance's European acquisitions were not all cleanly documented by modern standards, there could be claims from European institutions or families." Nora thought about Thomas Vance spending years going through everything, tracing what he could trace, corresponding anonymously with curators, trying to make it clean. "Thomas Vance believed he had resolved the provenance questions," she said. "I'm sure he did. Whether he was right is something we'll need to establish carefully." Fiona tapped her pen against the desk. "Nora, I'm going to take your case. Pro bono for the initial phase. The collection, if it's what the preliminary assessment suggests, will generate enough attention that there will be options to fund ongoing legal support. But I need you to do 3 things immediately." "Tell me." "First, change the locks. Both of them. New padlock, and if you can get a locksmith out there, a new secondary lock on the storage room door in addition to the original. The original lock should stay intact as evidence of your rightful access, but you need additional security." "Okay." "Second, do not speak to Raymond Vance or Marlowe Sinclair without me present from this point forward. If they call, you say, 'Please speak with my attorney,' and you give them my number." "Done." "Third," Fiona paused, "I need you to prepare yourself for something. When this becomes public, people are going to look at you and see a 17-year-old with no family and no resources and no credentials, and they're going to question why this collection should be yours. Raymond Vance is going to make that argument. His lawyers are going to make that argument. The press might make that argument. You need to be ready to answer it clearly and without anger." "Why is it mine?" Nora said. "Because Thomas Vance chose you. Because the law says so. Because you've had the key your whole life and didn't know it, and you came here anyway when you did." Fiona looked at her steadily. "But those are the legal and factual answers. The human answer is the one that's going to matter most in the court of public opinion, which is where this is also going to be fought." "The human answer," Nora said, "is that a man knew he was running out of time, and he made a plan for someone who would need something to hold on to. And I am that someone, and the plan worked." Fiona was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, that's exactly the human answer." She changed the locks that weekend. She hired a locksmith from the nearest town using the last of what she had in her account, a young man named Daryl, who did not ask why she needed 2 new deadbolts on a property that looked like no one had cared for it in 20 years, who just did the work and took the payment and drove back down the gravel track, without ceremony. She kept the original lock in place, both locks on the storage room door, the old and the new, the key that had always belonged to her, and the modern key that was simply practical. She stood in the room after Darryl left, alone in the climate-controlled air, in the soft illumination of the LED lighting that Burton had connected to a generator for his assessment days. She walked along the shelves slowly. She had not touched anything. She had been careful about that. But she was alone now, and she let herself look, really look, in the way she had looked at books in the library for years, with the understanding that looking was itself a form of contact, that attention was a kind of relationship. She stopped in front of the violin case. It was still open from Burton's examination. The silk had settled back around it. The instrument lay inside like something sleeping. She thought about what it would mean if Burton was right. If the label said what he had read. If the varnish and the grain and the neck angle and the F-holes all confirmed what the label suggested. If this was a 1716 Stradivarius, made during what the scholars called the Golden Period, the years when Antonio Stradivari was in his 70s and working at the height of his powers, making instruments that the greatest musicians in the world had played for 300 years and that museums and foundations and collectors had fought over ever since. She thought about Clement Vance standing in a workshop in Cremona in 1884 or 1885, a young man from a county no one had heard of, learning the craft from someone who had learned it from someone who had been there when these things were made. She thought about the flat case in the middle shelving, the one that Dr. Anand had opened and held still over for a long time before saying what he had said. For violin alone, unfinished. She thought about a composer in Vienna or Prague or Salzburg sitting at a desk in the late 18th century writing music that no one else knew about. Music that had traveled in a case through 2 centuries and an ocean and a gravel road to end up in a stone room that smelled of old wood and careful preservation, waiting for someone who had the key. She was that someone. She had always been that someone. She just hadn't known it until 3 weeks ago when a woman named Denise Pollard had handed her a shoebox on a sidewalk at 7:30 in the morning and changed the direction of everything. She closed the violin case carefully. She turned off the lights. She locked both locks on the storage room door. First the new deadbolt, then the old lock with the key, the sequence of clicks that she had come to think of as a kind of sentence, patient and deliberate, that said, "This is mine. I am here. I have always been here." She walked out into the cold and locked the front door and stood on the porch in the early dark of November. Her phone rang. It was Fiona. Sinclair called. Fiona said, "They want to move the meeting up. They're proposing next week instead of the 3 weeks we agreed." Nora looked at the birch trees at the end of the track, white in the last light. "Why the rush?" she said. "My guess? They found out about the appraiser. Possibly Dr. Anand has colleagues who talk. Possibly Raymond Vance has been in contact with people in the field, and word has started to travel." Fiona's voice was steady. "I told Sinclair the timeline stands. 3 weeks. Good. But Nora," a pause, "I need you to be prepared for things to move fast. If the assessment confirms what the preliminary indicates, we may not be able to control the pace. Information moves, and once it's out we won't be able to put it back. I know. You're doing well. I want you to know that." Nora was not accustomed to being told she was doing well. She did not know what to do with it. So she said, "Thank you." And she meant it. And she hung up. She caught the last bus back to the city. She sat in the back and held the key and thought about Thomas Vance, who had built a room and locked a door and put a key around a baby's neck and trusted the future to carry it forward. The future had not been gentle to Nora. 13 years of group homes and placements and a shoebox on a sidewalk. But here she was. She had found the house. She had opened the room. She had sat in a lawyer's office and in an appraiser's car and in a cold porch in November, and she had held herself together with the specific steadiness of someone who had learned that no one was coming, but that was all right, because she was already there. The assessment was completed on the 4th day. Burton Hale and Dr. Anand sat with her at the kitchen table of the house with a laptop and a binder of notes and photographs, and they told her what they had found. 7 violins, of which 3 had labels indicating Cremonese origin and construction details consistent with those claims. 1 instrument, the first case opened, with a label indicating Antonio Stradivari and the year 1716, assessed as requiring full laboratory analysis but presenting no obvious indicators of inauthenticity and several strong indicators of authenticity. Preliminary estimated value pending full authentication, between $15 and $22 million. One instrument in the sixth case with a label indicating Giuseppe Guarneri del Gesù, the maker whose instruments some considered equal or superior to Stradivari, estimated to be from approximately 1735, also requiring full authentication, preliminary estimated value between 12 and 18 million. The remaining instruments, including the pieces from the sealed containers, classified as period instruments of significant historical value, collectively estimated between 2 and 6 million pending authentication. The flat storage cases containing letters, correspondence, documentation, and manuscripts. 41 of the 46 cases opened. 5 held aside for more delicate handling. The letters and correspondence of historical value, but not individually extraordinary. The manuscript in Case 5. Burton paused there. He looked at Dr. Anand. Dr. Anand looked at Nora. I sent photographs to a colleague at the university, Dr. Anand said. A musicologist who specializes in the classical period. She has seen the photographs. She has reviewed the notation, the handwriting, the paper composition as far as can be determined from photographs. She wants to examine the original in person. He stopped. Her preliminary response, and I want to be very clear that this is preliminary and must not be communicated publicly as anything more than that, was that she had not seen anything like this outside of institutional collections, and that if it was what it appeared to be, it was extraordinary. What does it appear to be? Nora said. An autograph manuscript, meaning written in the composer's own hand. A violin composition, unfinished, in a style and notation consistent with Mozart's late period, approximately 1789 to 1791, the last years of his life. Dr. Anand's voice was careful and quiet. There are compositions from that period that are unaccounted for, that scholars have believed may exist, but have never been found. This may be one of them. The kitchen was very still. Outside, the birch trees were pale shapes in the dusk. What would that be worth? Nora said. I cannot put a number on it, Dr. Anand said. There is no comparable sale. An authenticated lost Mozart manuscript is not something that comes to market. Institutions would compete for it. Governments might involve themselves. It would be. He stopped. It would be one of the most significant musical discoveries of the modern era. Burton Hale closed his binder. He looked at Nora with the expression she had first seen on his face in the doorway of the storage room. The expression of someone whose professional equanimity was working very hard to contain something larger. The trunk, he said. We opened it this morning. She had not asked about the trunk yet. She had been moving through the information in sequence, taking each piece in before the next, the discipline of someone who had learned that taking on too much at once made you drop things. What was in the trunk, she said. Documents, Burton said. Legal documents, primarily. Correspondence between Thomas Vance and a lawyer in 1999, 2 years before his death. The lawyer's name is on the letterhead. His office is in the city. The documents detail Thomas's efforts to establish a legal framework for the collection that would survive his death. He was trying to set up a foundation. What kind of foundation? A public trust. His intent was to make the collection accessible, not to sell it, not to keep it private, to create a permanent institution that would allow scholars and the public access to the instruments and documents. Burton looked at her steadily. He ran out of time. He died before the foundation was fully established, but the documents include a letter he wrote to the lawyer explaining his intentions. He slid a photograph across the table. It was a photograph of a handwritten letter, the same precise handwriting she had seen in the trust document and the deed supplement, careful and deliberate, every word placed as though it mattered. She read it. The collection was gathered by my grandfather not for himself, but for the future. He understood that things of this nature, things that carry in them the whole effort of human creativity and craft, belong not to the family that holds them, but to the world that made them possible. I have kept them safe. I have documented them to the best of my ability. I have done what could be done in the time I had. I cannot complete what needs to be done, but I trust that the right person will find their way here. I have made certain of that. When they do, I ask only that they honor what my grandfather began, that they make it available, that they let it be seen. That has always been the point. Nora set the photograph down on the table. The right person will find their way here. I have made certain of that. He had put the key around her neck. He had made certain. He wanted it to be public, she said. Yes, Burton said. He wanted a foundation. Open access. No sale. She thought about Raymond Vance and his lawyer and their language of shared stewardship and appropriate institutions. She thought about what Raymond had said in the conference room, that Thomas had talked about the collection the way other fathers talked about religion, like it was sacred, like it was a responsibility. And then Raymond had turned away from it. And Thomas had run out of time. And the key had gone around a baby's neck, and the baby had gone into a shoebox, and the shoebox had waited 17 years on a shelf. And now the baby was at a kitchen table in a cold house with a lawyer on her side, and an appraiser's binder full of preliminary assessments that suggested the room behind the kitchen contained things of extraordinary value and extraordinary importance. "I need to talk to Fiona," she said. "Yes," Burton said. "You do." She called her from the porch. Fiona listened to the full account, the 7 violins, the Stradivarius label, the Guarneri, the manuscript, the trunk, and Thomas Vance's letter about the foundation he had meant to create. When Nora finished, Fiona was quiet for a moment. "All right," she said. "Here's what's going to happen. The meeting with Sinclair and Vance is in 9 days. We're going to walk into that meeting with the full preliminary assessment, with Thomas Vance's letter from the trunk, and with a proposal." "What proposal?" "The one Thomas wanted," Fiona said. "A foundation. Public access. The collection stays together, stays accessible, and is managed by a board that includes you as the founding trustee. Raymond will fight that. Raymond wants money. If we offer him a settlement that acknowledges his family connection without giving him control of the collection, he may take it. His lawyer knows his adverse possession claim is weak. The trust document language is clear. He's in a negotiation, not a strong legal position. And if he won't settle, then we take it to court and we win," Fiona said calmly. "But I think he'll settle. I think when he sees what Thomas wrote in that letter, he'll understand what his father wanted, and either he'll honor it or he won't be able to look at himself." Nora thought about Raymond's scarred hands and his 40 years of regret and the way he had said, "You're like him." "He might actually honor it," she said. "He might," Fiona agreed. "People surprise you sometimes." The 9 days before the meeting were the longest and the shortest of Nora's life simultaneously. Long because each one required her to hold steady in the face of uncertainty, and short because each one moved her closer to something that felt like a reckoning. She worked her overnight shift and went to the library in the days and sat with the archive records and thought. She also, on a Wednesday afternoon, went back to the house alone and sat in the storage room for an hour. She did not touch anything. She sat on the floor in the middle of the room, the way Burton Hale had sat that first day, cross-legged on the sealed planks with the shelves rising around her on all sides, the cases and the flat containers and the sealed climate monitors and the empty trunk whose contents were now photographed and preserved in Fiona's files and Burton's binder. She thought about Clement Vance in a workshop in Cremona, a young man learning what it meant to understand an instrument well enough to restore it. She thought about him bringing things home across an ocean because he understood their value when no one else did. She thought about the generations that had followed him, grandfather, father, son, each one taking the responsibility and passing it forward, until it reached Thomas, who had run out of time, and Thomas, who had put the key around her neck and trusted the future. She thought about what it meant to be the end of that chain, the last link, the one the whole thing had been passed to. She thought about what Thomas had written. "I trust that the right person will find their way here. I have made certain of that." He had not known her. He had known an infant. He had made a bet on a baby, and the baby had grown up in the system and come out the other side with nothing but a key and a refusal to fold. And here she was. "When they do, I ask only that they honor what my grandfather began." She was going to honor it. She did not know yet exactly how. She did not know what a foundation looked like in practice, or what a board of trustees did, or how you raised the money to run an institution that made a collection worth potentially hundreds of millions of dollars available to the public for free. She did not know any of that. But she had a key, and she had a lawyer, and she had a preliminary assessment from a man who had spent 40 years doing this work and who had sat down on the floor of the room in the specific stunned way of someone encountering something beyond their preparation. She had been encountering things beyond her preparation her entire life. She knew how to do that. She locked the room and the house and walked to the end of the track and stood by the mailbox with her name on it in the late afternoon dark of November, and she looked back at the house. The white clapboard still weathered gray. The porch still sagging at the corner. The birch trees behind her, white bark bright in the low light. She was going to fix the porch. She was going to fix the windows and the roof section and the kitchen and the rooms upstairs with the extraordinary wallpaper. She was going to make this house into something that matched what was in its foundation, something worth entering, something Thomas Vance would recognize as the place he had meant it to be. But first she had a meeting in 9 days, and she was not going to lose it. The morning of the meeting arrived the way important mornings always did, quietly, without ceremony, as though the day had not been told what it was carrying. Nora woke at 5 in the church shelter and lay on her cot in the dark and ran through everything she knew. The trust document, the deed supplement from 1962, the archive records connecting Thomas Aldous Vance to the property, the foster care intake form with its handwritten note, "That's Grandpa's. He said give it to me when I was big enough." Burton Hale's preliminary assessment in its binder, Dr. Anand's photographs and notes, Thomas Vance's letter from the trunk, Fiona's legal analysis of the adverse possession claim and its weakness, the bloodline she could trace through Raymond's own admission that her mother had been his daughter. She had all of it. She had built it piece by piece over 6 weeks the way she built everything, one careful step at a time, trusting that patience and thoroughness were more reliable than speed. She got up and dressed in the cleanest version of what she had. She had bought one new thing for this meeting, a dark blazer from the Goodwill on Clemens Street for $7. The kind of blazer that said, "I am taking this seriously," without saying, "I am pretending to be something I am not." She put it on over her best shirt and looked at herself in the bathroom mirror for a moment. She was 17 years old. She had a key around her neck and a lawyer named Fiona Marsh and a binder full of preliminary assessments and the specific steadiness of someone who had been fighting for things that were hers for as long as she could remember. She was ready. Fiona met her in the lobby of the building on Hartwell Avenue where Marlowe Sinclair's office was located, which was a different building from before, larger, the kind of building that charged by the foot. Fiona was in her usual focused mode, dark coat, briefcase, the brisk forward energy of someone who had reviewed the case thoroughly and was prepared to hold the line. She looked at Nora's blazer. "Good," she said simply. They went up together. The conference room was larger than the one they had used before. Marlowe Sinclair was already there, portfolio open, associate in place. Raymond Vance sat beside her, and this time there was a second lawyer with him, a younger man named Pierce who introduced himself with a handshake that was calibrated to be firm enough to signal confidence without crossing into aggression. There was also a fourth person in the room, a man in his 60s who had not been introduced yet and who sat slightly back from the table in the posture of an observer rather than a participant. Nora sat across from Raymond. Their eyes met briefly. He looked tired. He also looked, she thought, like a person who had been rehearsing something and was not sure it was going to go the way he practiced. "Thank you for coming," Sinclair began. "I think we all share an interest in reaching a resolution that serves everyone's goals and honors the Vance family legacy appropriately." Fiona opened her briefcase. "We appreciate the sentiment. We're prepared to make a proposal today that we believe does exactly that. Before we get to the proposal, I'd like to establish a few facts for the record." Sinclair nodded. The Vance Family Preservation Trust, established 1962, is a valid legal instrument. The language of the trust is unambiguous. The lower storage room at 14, Birch Hollow Road, and all contents therein belong to the holder of the original entry key. My client has held that key since she was 4 years old, received it as the named recipient in the trust succession provision. We have the foster care intake documentation confirming this. Fiona laid a copy on the table and slid it towards Sinclair. We also have a preliminary assessment of the collection's contents, conducted by Burton Hale and Dr. Priya Anand, both certified appraisers with decades of relevant experience. She placed the binder on the table. Pierce leaned forward slightly. Sinclair's expression did not change, but her stillness deepened in the way of someone paying close attention. The preliminary assessment identifies 7 historical string instruments, 2 of which present strong initial indicators of Crimini's origin dating to the early 18th century and are currently under further authentication review. It also identifies 46 flat storage cases containing correspondence, documentation, and 1 manuscript requiring specialist analysis. The trunk contained personal and legal papers belonging to Thomas Aldous Vance, including a letter to his attorney dated 1999. Fiona placed a copy of the letter on the table. Raymond Vance looked at it. He did not pick it up immediately. This letter documents Thomas Vance's intention to establish a public foundation for the collection, Fiona continued. An institution providing open access to the instruments and manuscripts for scholars and the general public. He was unable to complete that process before his death. My client intends to honor that intention. The room was quiet for a moment. Nora watched Raymond Vance. He had picked up the letter now. He was reading it. She could see his eyes moving across the page, and she could see, because she had gotten very good at reading very small signals. The moment he reached the line she had read 8 times herself. I trust that the right person will find their way here. I have made certain of that. His jaw moved slightly. He put the letter down. Mr. Vance, Fiona said, we understand you have a family connection to the property and a genuine interest in how the collection is handled. We're not dismissing that. What we're proposing is a framework that honors both Thomas Vance's wishes and your family's historical relationship with the collection. What framework? Pierce said. The Vance Collection Foundation, Fiona said. A public charitable trust, established with my client as founding trustee. The collection remains intact and is made available for scholarly research and public exhibition. The foundation is governed by a board that includes a designated Vance family representative seat, which Mr. Raymond Vance may occupy for the duration of his lifetime if he chooses. Sinclair's pen moved once across her notepad, and the legal ownership of the collection remains with the foundation in perpetuity. No piece of the collection may be sold. Pierce looked at Sinclair. Our client was expecting a different structure. I'm sure he was, Fiona said evenly. But I'd invite you to consider what your client's legal position actually is. The adverse possession claim does not extend to the storage room, which your client never occupied and to which he never had access. The trust document language is clear. The bloodline is established. My client is Thomas Vance's granddaughter through your client's own daughter. Your client is 1 generation removed from Thomas. My client is the lineal descendant named in the trust. She paused. We can litigate this. We are prepared to litigate this. But litigation will be public, the assessment findings will be public, and the story of a man trying to take a collection from his orphaned teenage grandniece who has held the key since infancy is not a story that plays well. Pierce opened his mouth. Sinclair put a hand briefly on his arm, and he closed it. Raymond Vance said, Can I speak directly to Nora? Fiona looked at Nora. Nora nodded. Raymond leaned forward slightly. His large hands were flat on the table. He looked at her with the tired eyes of a person who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and was deciding whether to set it down. I read what my father wrote, he said. In that letter. I know. He said the right person would find their way here. That he'd made certain of it. Raymond stopped. He meant you. Yes. He put the key around your neck before you could walk. He knew he wasn't going to live to explain it. He knew the family had failed. His voice was quiet and without self-pity, which made it harder to hear than if it had been full of it. He trusted a baby because there was no one else left to trust. And the baby grew up, Nora said, and found her way here. Raymond looked at her for a long moment. You're how old? 17. My daughter was 17 when she left home, he said. We didn't speak much after that. She died at 23. I didn't know about you until this. He gestured at the room, the table, the binder, all of it. I should have looked harder. Nora held his gaze. She did not say it's all right because it was not entirely all right. She did not say I forgive you because forgiveness was something she would need time to understand in this particular context. She said, Thomas tried to do what he could with the time he had. That's all any of us can do. Raymond was quiet. The foundation, he said finally. The board seat. It's yours if you want it. He looked at Pierce. Pierce's face was professionally neutral. Sinclair was making notes. I want one condition, Raymond said. Tell me. The first. Public exhibition. I want it named for Thomas. Not the collection, not the foundation generally. The first exhibition, the one that opens this to the public. Named for him. Nora thought about the man she had never known who had nonetheless thought of her. Who had built a room and locked a door and made a plan across a distance neither of them could have measured. Yes, she said. That's exactly right. Raymond nodded once. He looked at Sinclair. We accept the framework. Pierce started to say something. Sinclair shook her head slightly, and he stopped. We'll need to review the specific terms of the foundation documents, Sinclair said. There are details to negotiate. Of course, Fiona said. We can begin that process today. The man at the back of the room spoke for the first time. His voice was measured and deliberate, the voice of someone who chose when to speak carefully. "If I may." Everyone looked at him. "My name is Dr. Leonard Forsyth," he said. "I'm the Director of Acquisitions at the Meridian Institute." He looked at Nora. "I've been retained by Mr. Vance to assess the collection's institutional potential. I want to say, for the record, that what I've seen in the preliminary assessment materials is extraordinary. The Meridian would be honored to partner with a Vance Collection Foundation in any capacity you'd consider appropriate." Nora looked at him steadily. "What does partnership mean to the Meridian?" "It means resources, conservation staff, exhibition design, fundraising capacity. We have the infrastructure to help you build what Thomas Vance envisioned, if you're willing to work with us." "Not own," Nora said. "Partner." "Correct." She looked at Fiona, who gave the smallest nod. "We'll consider it," Nora said. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The negotiation of the foundation documents took 3 weeks. Fiona drove most of it with the focused precision of someone who had identified the goal and was not going to let procedural complexity obscure it. Nora attended every session. She asked questions that surprised the lawyers on both sides with their specificity. She had been reading everything she could find about nonprofit governance and charitable trust law and foundation management, and she held the line on the things that mattered and conceded on the things that did not. The collection would not be sold. Not one piece. That was the line. Everything else was negotiable. By the end of the 3 weeks, the Vance Collection Foundation was a legal entity. Nora was the founding trustee and board chair. Raymond Vance held the designated family seat. Dr. Forsyth represented the Meridian Institute in an advisory capacity. Fiona had recruited 2 additional board members, a musicologist from the State University named Dr. Clara Reyes, who had been following the case since Dr. Anand had contacted her about the manuscript, and a woman named Josephine Tate, who had spent 30 years running cultural nonprofits, and who had called Fiona unprompted after reading about the case online. Because the case had become public, it had happened the way Fiona had predicted, not catastrophically, but incrementally. Information moving through the networks of people who cared about these things. Dr. Anand's colleague at the university had mentioned the manuscript to a colleague of her own. Burton Hale had filed his preliminary assessment with the professional body that required him to do so. Someone had noticed. Someone had talked. The first article appeared in a music history journal's online newsletter, Careful and Hedged, noting that a preliminary assessment of an unstudied private collection had identified instruments of potential historical significance and a manuscript warranting further examination. The article named no names and made no definitive claims. The second article was in a national newspaper and was not careful or hedged at all. Lost Stradivarius and Mozart manuscript may have been found in private collection, the headline read. The article named Nora. It named the property. It named Raymond Vance and the foundation and, briefly, the fact that the person who held the key to the collection was a 17-year-old who had aged out of foster care 6 weeks before the discovery. Her phone did not stop ringing for 4 days. She did not answer most of the calls. The ones she answered were the ones from numbers she recognized: Fiona, Fiona's assistant, Burton Hale calling to apologize that the news had moved faster than he'd controlled, Dr. Anand calling to say the same thing, and Dr. Clara Reyes, who had called not to apologize but to say, "I've reviewed the manuscript photographs more carefully and I need to get into that room as soon as possible." The ones she did not answer were the reporters, the collectors, the institution representatives, the people who wanted things from her that she had not yet decided whether to give. There were also, woven through all of it, messages from strangers who had read the newspaper article and written to tell her something about themselves. Foster care alumni who said they were proud of her. Young people in difficult situations who said she had given them something to hold on to. People who had lost things and found them, and people who were still looking. She read those. She did not respond to most of them because she did not have the capacity to respond to all of them, and she was not going to respond to some and not others, but she read them, and she held them in the part of herself where she kept the things that mattered. The authentication process took for months. For months of experts traveling to Birch Hollow Road and descending into the storage room with their equipment and their notebooks. The climate control system Thomas Vance had built by hand in 1971 performed exactly as it had been built to perform, maintaining the precise conditions that had kept everything in the room stable for more than 50 years, and the experts commented on it with a specific reverence that Nora had come to recognize as the highest form of professional praise. The acknowledgement that someone without credentials or institutional support had nonetheless done something correctly. The violin was authenticated. The announcement was made by Burton Hale in a formal assessment report filed with 3 independent verification bodies, that the instrument designated Item 1A in the Vance Collection Preliminary Assessment was a genuine Antonio Stradivari violin, crafted in Cremona in 1716, in the Golden Period. One of fewer than 500 such instruments known to exist, and one of fewer than 60 from the specific peak years. The estimated value, pending market conditions at time of any hypothetical sale, which there would not be, was between $18 and $24 million. The 6th case, the one Burton had opened second, was authenticated 2 weeks later. A genuine Giuseppe Guarneri del Gesù, 1735. Estimated value between 14 and 19 million. The remaining instruments were authenticated as period instruments of significant historical value. 3 of them attributed to workshops in Cremona operating in the same tradition as the great makers, 2 attributed directly to Clement Vance himself as a maker of exceptional quality. The manuscript took longer. Dr. Clara Reyes spent 6 weeks in the room with the 5th flat case and its contents and a team of 3 colleagues from the university and an independent specialist from Vienna who had spent his career studying late Mozart autographs. They used spectroscopic analysis on the paper and the ink. They analyzed the notation style character by character against authenticated Mozart manuscripts held in European institutions. They compared the handwriting against every documented sample. The report they filed was 87 pages long. The conclusion was on page 3. The manuscript designated Item 5C in the Vance collection is, with a confidence level of 94%, an autograph manuscript in the hand of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, composed between 1789 and 1791. It is an incomplete composition for solo violin in D major, comprising 43 measures of primary material and 17 measures of sketched continuation. No record of this composition exists in the established Mozart catalog. This represents a previously unknown work from the composer's final years and constitutes one of the most significant musicological discoveries of the modern era. Nora read that report sitting at the kitchen table of the house on Birch Hollow Road, which by then had a new roof and repaired porch supports and clean windows and heat, because the foundation had allocated resources for the building's restoration as part of preparing the property for its future purpose, and she had overseen every element of it personally. Not because she had to, but because Thomas Vance had cared about this house, and she was going to honor that. She read the report, and then she sat quietly for a while and looked out the kitchen window at the birch trees, which were in their winter state, white bark and bare branches against a pale January sky. Clement Vance had brought something home from Cremona that he had recognized when no one else did. Thomas Vance had protected it for 50 years at personal cost. A man who had died before she could walk had put a key around her neck and trusted that she would find her way. And she had. She was here. And the thing in the room was real. She pulled out her phone and called Fiona. "I read the report," Nora said. "I know. I read it this morning." Fiona's voice was steady, the same focused steadiness it always was. But underneath it Nora could hear something that was the professional equivalent of awe. 94% confidence. That's as close to certain as these things get. "What happens now?" "Now," Fiona said, "we open the doors." The planning for the first exhibition took 6 more months. The Meridian Institute provided the conservation staff and the exhibition designers and the fundraising infrastructure they had promised, and Dr. Forsyth proved to be a man of his word, which Nora had been prepared not to assume and was pleased to discover. Josephine Tate ran the operational build-out with the efficiency of someone who had done this 30 times and knew exactly where things went wrong and how to prevent it. Nora was in every meeting. She was 18 by the time the exhibition opened, which felt significant in a way she did not entirely articulate, that she had crossed from the age of being processed by systems to the age of building one, in the span of 1 year, in the span of a key and a room and a trust in the future. She was also no longer sleeping on a church shelter cot. She was living in the house on Birch Hollow Road, in the upstairs room with the extraordinary blue and white wallpaper, the room where someone had chosen carefully what would be beautiful, as though they had known that beauty mattered in the same way that food mattered, as a fundamental sustenance rather than a luxury. She had kept her overnight cleaning job for 3 months after the foundation was established, because she did not trust that things would hold until she had evidence that they were holding. When the Meridian Partnership was formalized and the foundation's first grant was approved, she had sat with those documents for 2 days before she allowed herself to believe they were real. Then she had given her notice, thanked her supervisor, and returned the gray uniform. She had bought herself one thing with the first month of the modest stipend the foundation provided its founding trustee: a book, a first edition, purchased legally from an antiquarian bookseller, of a collection of poetry she had read in fragments in library reading rooms for years. She kept it on the nightstand in the upstairs room, and she read from it sometimes before she slept, in the house that had her name on the mailbox, in the room with the wallpaper someone had chosen because they believed beauty was worth choosing. The exhibition opened on a Saturday in late spring, in the room beneath the house that had been carefully adapted for public access, the stone staircase reinforced and properly lit. The original storage room expanded through careful excavation of the adjacent space into a proper gallery that preserved the original chamber while creating the capacity to receive visitors. The climate control system Thomas Vance had built was maintained and supplemented with modern equipment that operated alongside it, the old and the new together, the way the key and the new deadbolt had operated on the storage room door. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The name above the entrance, cut into the stone in letters that would last longer than any of them, read, "The Thomas Aldous Vance Gallery." Nora had stood at the stonecutter's workshop when they made it and watched every letter take shape, and she had not cried there either, though she had wanted to. The morning the gallery opened to the public, she stood at the entrance at 8 o'clock, an hour before the doors were scheduled to open, and she looked at the line that had already formed outside. It was longer than she had expected. It went up the stone steps and across the porch of the house, which had been restored to something close to what it had been when it was first built, white clapboard in a wide porch and rocking chairs that actually rocked, and down the track to the road, and along the road past the birch trees. People had driven from other cities. A musicologist from Berlin had flown in specifically to see the manuscript. A school group from the city had been given priority access for the morning session as part of the foundation's educational programming commitment. 32 children between the ages of 9 and 14, most of them from schools in low-income districts, who had been told they were going to see something extraordinary. Nora watched the school group come up the track at 8:45 in a loose cluster of winter coats and backpacks, and the specific restless energy of children who had been told to be patient and were doing their best. Their teacher, a woman about Fiona's age, walked at the back of the group with the alert attention of someone responsible for 32 small people in an unfamiliar environment. She met them at the door. "My name is Nora Vance," she said to the group. "This is my family's collection. It's been here for a long time waiting to be shared. I'm glad you're the first ones to see it." A boy in a red coat, maybe 11 years old, raised his hand with the urgency of someone who had been holding a question for a while. "Is it true there's a real Stradivarius?" he said. "There is," Nora said. "Can we see it? That's why you're here." She led them down the reinforced stone staircase into the gallery. She watched their faces as the motion sensor lights activated section by section, the illumination traveling along the shelves of cases and the flat storage containers, and the manuscript display at the center of the room, where the Mozart composition was displayed under glass, the 43 measures of primary material, and the 17 measures of sketched continuation, the unfinished thing that had nonetheless survived 3 centuries to be seen. A girl with her hair in 2 braids stopped in front of the violin case and looked at the instrument for a long time without speaking. Nora went and stood beside her. "It's so small," the girl said finally. "Violins usually are. But it's worth so much." "Yes." The girl looked at it for another moment. "How do you know something small is worth that much?" Nora thought about the question. It was a better question than most of the ones she had been asked by journalists and academics and institution directors over the past months. It was the question that mattered. "You learn to recognize what you're looking at," she said. And sometimes someone teaches you how to look. The girl nodded slowly. She kept looking at the violin with the expression Nora recognized because she had worn it herself in library reading rooms for years, the expression of someone encountering something that made the world feel larger than they had been told it was. Raymond Vance arrived at 10 o'clock after the school group had moved through and the first wave of general admission visitors was filtering in. He came alone, without lawyers or associates, in the same work pants and flannel shirt she had first seen him in. He walked through the entrance and stopped at the top of the stone staircase and looked down at what had been built from the room his grandfather had made. Then he looked at Nora. "My father would have liked you," he said. "I think I would have liked him." Raymond nodded. He looked at the stone letters above the gallery entrance. The Thomas. Aldous Vance Gallery. "He tried for so long to get this right," Raymond said. "He used to say, 'The collection is waiting. It knows it needs to be seen.' I thought he was being sentimental." He paused. "I was wrong about a lot of things." "You're here now," Nora said. "I am." He looked at her with the tired eyes that had more life in them now than when she'd first seen them across the conference table. "My daughter, your mother, she was a lot like you. Stubborn. Certain about things. She left because I didn't know how to hear her." He stopped. "I've had a long time to think about that." Nora held his gaze. "You have a board seat," she said. "You're part of this. That's not nothing." "No," he agreed. "It's not nothing." He went down the stairs, and she watched him walk slowly through the gallery, stopping at each case, reading each placard, taking his time the way a person did when they were trying to absorb something that was larger than a single look could hold. She had written the placards herself, every word of them, working with Dr. Reyes and Dr. Forsyth to get the language right, specific and accessible, the language of someone who wanted people to understand what they were looking at without needing to have already known. She had spent 2 weeks on the placard for the manuscript alone, trying to find the words that would explain what it meant that a piece of music written in the last years of a composer's life had traveled through a century and a half and an ocean to end up in a stone room in a county no one had heard of, waiting for the right key and the right person. She had written, finally. This manuscript was written between 1789 and 1791, in the final years of Mozart's life. It is incomplete. We do not know why he stopped. We know that he kept it, and that it traveled, and that it was preserved by people who recognized its value when others might not have. It has been waiting to be heard. A recording made from these 43 measures is available at the listening station to your left. Dr. Reyes had commissioned the recording. A violinist from the State Symphony had played the extant measures in the gallery itself. The performance recorded on equipment that captured not just the music but the acoustics of the stone room, the space that had held it silent for so long. The recording played on a loop at the listening station by the manuscript case, quiet enough not to overwhelm the room, but present, the way something that has waited a long time is present when it is finally given space. Nora stood beside the listening station for a while on the opening day and watched people put on the headphones and listen. She watched their faces change when the music reached them. There was something in what Clement Vance had brought home from Cremona, in the instrument playing what Mozart had written, in the specific quality of 43 measures of something that had been unfinished for 230 years, that reached people in the part of themselves that was not about knowledge or credentials or money or any of the things that were supposed to matter. It reached the part of them that was simply human, the part that recognized beauty and was moved by it and did not need to be told why. An elderly man stood at the listening station for 11 minutes. When he took off the headphones, his eyes were wet, and he looked embarrassed about it for a moment, and then he did not look embarrassed. He just looked like a person who had heard something that mattered. He saw Nora watching, and he said, "What did he mean to finish, do you think?" "We don't know," she said. "Nobody knows. But you can feel where it was going," he said. "You can almost hear the rest of it. Like it's still there somewhere, waiting." "Yes," she said. "Like that." The day continued. More visitors. More faces. The journalists who had been given limited access to the opening produced their articles by afternoon, and Nora's phone filled again with messages. But they were different messages now. People who had seen the articles and listened to the clips of the recording that the Foundation had posted online, and who wrote to say things about what it meant to them, what the story meant, what it meant that a 17-year-old who had aged out of foster care had been the one to find this, had been the one it was waiting for. She read those messages the way she had read the first wave of them, holding them in the part of herself where she kept the things that mattered. Fiona found her in the early afternoon sitting on the porch of the house in the spring sun. The gallery below was still receiving visitors. The sound of footsteps on the stone staircase and the murmur of voices reached them from below, muffled and continuous, the sound of the thing working. Fiona sat beside her. "How are you doing?" she said. It was not a question Nora had been asked often in her life. She considered it seriously. "I'm thinking about Thomas," she said. "He built that room in secret. He maintained it alone for 30 years. He corresponded with museum curators anonymously because he didn't want anyone to know what he had. He was afraid of what would happen if they knew." She paused. "He spent his life protecting something that was meant to be seen and never got to see it be seen." "He saw it," Fiona said. "He just couldn't see the specific day." Nora looked at the birch trees. "The inscription on the key," she said. "For the one who comes after. The lock has been waiting." "Yes. He wrote that for me, not knowing who I would be, not knowing if I would be at all." She turned the key over in her palm, the warm brass, the small arched door of the key's head, the worn inscription. He just trusted that someone would come, that the right person would be there when the lock needed opening. "And you were," Fiona said. "I was." She closed her hand around the key. "I didn't have anything else. When Denise handed me that shoebox, I had a bus pass and $300 and a key I didn't understand. I had nothing else." "You had everything you needed," Fiona said. Nora was quiet for a moment. "I used to think that was the kind of thing people said to make you feel better about not having things. I used to think it was a lie they told to comfortable people who wanted to believe that poverty built character. And now," she looked at the house. The restored white clapboard, the porch that no longer sagged, the windows clear and bright, the stone letters above the gallery entrance visible from the porch steps, the Thomas Vance Gallery, and below them the faint continuous sound of people encountering something that had been waiting for them. "Now I think it's more specific than that," she said. "I think what I had was the key and the stubbornness and the habit of not giving up, which I learned because I had to learn it because there was no one else to do the not giving up for me." She paused. "And I think Thomas knew that would be true. He knew whoever held that key would have had to fight to get to the age where they could use it. He put it around a baby's neck and trusted that the baby would grow up with exactly what the situation required. Which was someone who understood that things worth having are worth fighting for," she said. "Someone who wasn't going to be talked out of what was theirs by people with lawyers and confident voices and conference rooms designed to make them feel small." She looked at Fiona. Someone who'd sat in enough rooms being told they didn't belong to have stopped believing that. Fiona was quiet for a moment. "He chose well," she said. "He didn't know me," Nora said. "He chose correctly anyway. I think that's the more remarkable thing. That you can make a good choice about someone you've never met if you understand what the situation requires and you trust the future to provide it. He trusted you. He trusted whoever would come. I happened to be the one who came." She stood from the porch chair. Below, through the open gallery entrance, the sound of voices rose and fell. Visitors moving through the space Thomas Vance had built for something it had taken 3 more generations to fulfill. "I have a meeting with the board at 4, she said. "We're discussing the second exhibition." "What's the theme?" "Craft," Nora said. "The relationship between maker and material. Clement Vance as a maker, the instruments as objects made by hands that understood their purpose. We want to commission a luthier to demonstrate the craft in the gallery. Show people how something like this comes into being." She paused. "And we're talking to 3 universities about a fellowship program. Young people who want to study historical instruments or manuscript authentication but can't access the field for financial reasons. The foundation funds their first year." Fiona was smiling. "Thomas would be glad. Raymond suggested the fellowship," Nora said. "At the last board meeting. He said his father used to talk about how the craft was dying because no one could afford to learn it anymore. He said Thomas would have wanted to do something about that." She thought about Raymond's large scarred hands and the 40 years of regret and the way he had come to the opening alone and walked through the gallery reading every placard as though the words were things he needed to hold on to. "I think Raymond is going to be all right." "I think you're both going to be all right," Fiona said. Below them, a child's voice rose briefly above the murmur of the gallery, high and clear, asking a question Nora couldn't quite make out. Then the teacher's voice answering, and the sound of the recording from the listening station, 43 measures of something unfinished that had been waiting 2 centuries to be heard. Nora stood on the porch of the house with her name on the mailbox and her hand around the key and listened to all of it, the voices and the music and the birch trees moving in the spring wind, and she thought about Thomas Vance putting a key around a baby's neck and trusting the future. She thought about what it meant to be the future someone had trusted. It meant something specific and practical and daily. It meant showing up. It meant building what you said you would build. It meant doing the work that the person before you had not had time to finish, not for them, not for the gratitude, but because the work was real and it mattered and someone had to do it, and you were the one who was here. She had been doing that her whole life without knowing what it was building toward. Now she knew. The key was old and warm in her hand. The inscription was worn smooth with decades of contact. The letters still readable if you tilted it to the light, if you knew how to look. For the one who comes after. The lock has been waiting. She had come after. She had found the lock. She had opened it. And what had been inside was not just instruments and manuscripts and documents, and a letter from a man who had run out of time. What had been inside was the proof that someone had thought of her before she was old enough to think of herself. That someone had made a plan for her survival and her future and her belonging in a specific place on this earth. That she had not been, as she had sometimes in the group home in the dark believed herself to be, a person without a story. She had a story. It was older than she was. It had been waiting for her to grow into it. She was 18 years old, and she was the founding trustee of a foundation that held instruments worth tens of millions of dollars and a manuscript that had rewritten the Mozart catalog and a house with extraordinary wallpaper in the upstairs bedroom and a board seat for a great-uncle who was learning, slowly and with some pain, to be worthy of the family he had not been. She was 18 years old, and she had a key that fit a lock that had been waiting 40 years and the discipline to have come looking for it with nothing but time and a library card and the specific refusal of someone who had never had enough to accept that not enough was the end of the story. It was not the end of the story. She went back inside to meet with her board. She left the key around her neck, where it had always been. 1 year after the gallery opened, the foundation hosted its first fellowship cohort. 8 young people from across the country who had demonstrated both talent and financial need in the field of historical instrument study or manuscript authentication. They arrived on a Saturday in May, 8 different people with 8 different stories, and the specific quality of people who had been told by their circumstances to want less and had decided to want more anyway. Nora met them on the porch of the house. She was 19 now. She had enrolled part-time at the State University in the fall, studying cultural heritage management, because she had decided that if she was going to do this work, she was going to do it properly, and she was going to know everything she needed to know. Dr. Reyes had written her a letter of recommendation that was, Fiona told her, one of the most extraordinary letters she had ever read. She stood on the porch in the May morning and looked at the 8 fellows and thought about the day she had stood on the sidewalk outside the group home with a shoebox under her arm. "Welcome," she said. "This is the Vance collection. It belongs to all of you now, in the way that things of this kind belong to everyone who takes the time to understand them." She paused. "You're going to spend the next year learning how to read what's in this room, what it is, what it means, how it was made, why it survived. You're also going to learn something that I can't teach you formally, but that I can tell you directly." 8 faces looking at her. "The things that matter most," she said, "are often the things no one else recognized. They're in rooms that no one thought to look in, behind locks that have been waiting for the right key, in collections that everyone assumed were gone. The work of this field is the work of looking carefully at what's been overlooked. That requires patience and thoroughness and the willingness to believe that something real might be there even before you have evidence that it is." She held up the key. "This key has been in my family since 1887, she said. "I have held it since I was 4 years old and didn't know what it was for. When I found out, I came here. I did not know what I would find. I only knew that the lock had been waiting and that I had the key." She looked at each of them in turn. "You're here because someone looked at you and saw someone who would recognize the value of what's been overlooked. Trust that. Do the work. Look carefully." She led them down the stone staircase into the gallery. She watched their faces as the lights came on, section by section, the illumination finding the cases and the manuscripts and the listening station with the recording of 43 measures of something that had waited 2 centuries to be heard. She had seen that expression many times now. She knew what it was. It was the expression of someone understanding that the world was larger than they had been told. She had worn it herself. In library reading rooms, at the city archive, on a gravel road in November outside a house with her name on the mailbox, in a stone room full of things that had been waiting for her. She was going to spend the rest of her life helping other people find that expression. That was what Thomas Vance had intended. That was what Clement Vance had begun. That was what the key around her neck had always been for. Not for her alone. For the ones who came after. All of them. The letter arrived on a Thursday in October, 14 months after the gallery opened, in a pale blue envelope with no return address and a postmark from a town in rural Austria that Nora had to look up on a map. She almost did not open it immediately. The foundation received a significant volume of mail by then, and she had developed the habit of sorting it at the end of the day rather than the beginning. But the handwriting on the envelope stopped her. Old handwriting, deliberate and slightly formal, with a quality she associated with the letters in the flat storage cases downstairs. Letters from another century's understanding of what communication required. She opened it. Inside was a single page, written in the same hand as the envelope, in English that was precise and slightly formal in the way of someone for whom it was a third or fourth language. Dear Ms. Vance, my name is Lieselot Marchetti. I am 83 years old and I live in Hallstatt, Austria, where I have lived my entire life. My grandfather was Enzo Marchetti, who trained luthiers in Cremona in the 1880s. I have been reading about your collection since the articles were published last year, and I have been trying to decide for 14 months whether to write to you. I have decided to write. My grandfather kept correspondence from his students. He was meticulous about this. After his death, the correspondence passed to my father, and after my father's death, to me. I have boxes of letters, hundreds of them, from students who trained with him over 40 years. Among them are 27 letters from a young American named Clement Vance, written between 1882 and 1886. They instrument as though it were a conversation he did not want to misunderstand. Nora looked at the young man in the photograph, dark-haired and uncertain in front of the camera in a workshop in Cremona in 1884, learning something he would carry home across an ocean and protect for the rest of his life, and pass to his son, who passed it to his son, who ran out of time and gave it to a baby. She was looking at the beginning of her story. The letters were in a wooden box under Lieselot's writing desk, tied in bundles by year with ribbon that had faded from what might once have been red to a dull orange. 27 letters, exactly as she had said. Clement's handwriting was recognizable even across a century and a half, precise and deliberate. The same quality she had seen in Thomas's handwriting in the trust document and the letter from the trunk, a family characteristic passed down alongside the instruments and the key and the understanding that some things required careful attention. Dr. Reyes worked through the letters with the focused intensity of her training, reading each one with a portable magnification device and making notes in the small, careful script she used in the field. Nora read alongside her, more slowly, not as a scholar but as something else, as the end of the line looking back at its beginning. In the 23rd letter, Clement described the violin. He wrote that he had been engaged to restore instruments from the estate of a collector named Arrighetti in Padua, and that among the instruments was one that had given him more difficulty than anything he had worked on before, not because it was damaged, but because he was afraid of making a mistake. He wrote that the collector's family had believed it to be from the golden period for 60 years, and he believed they were right, and the responsibility of that terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. He wrote that when he finished the restoration and the instrument sang again under the bow of the Arrighetti family's eldest daughter, he had understood for the first time what his teacher meant when he said that a luthier's work was not creation but revelation, that the instrument was already there, waiting for the hands that knew how to find it. The Arrighetti family had given him the violin as payment. He described this with a plainness that suggested he had not entirely believed it was happening. He described their reasoning, that they had no players of sufficient skill to do it justice, that a craftsman who could hear what it was deserved to hold it, that the instrument should be with someone who understood it. In the 26th letter, he described the manuscript. A scholar in Vienna clearing the estate of a music copyist had shown it to him almost as an afterthought, among a collection of papers that were being sorted for disposal. The scholar had identified it as a student exercise based on its unfinished state and had been preparing to discard it. Clement had asked to look at it more carefully. He described sitting with it for 2 hours in the scholar's study while the man went about his other business. He described the notation, the quality of the hand, the specific character of the phrasing that distinguished it from exercise, and placed it in the category of intention. He could not name the intention. He was a luthier, not a musicologist. But he knew that whoever had written this had written it the way the Arrighetti violin had been made, with the understanding that some things were worth the full attention of what you knew. He had asked the scholar what he intended to do with the papers. The scholar had said, "Burn most of them." The copyist was not significant. Clement had asked if he could take the manuscript. The scholar had said, "Take whatever you like. I have enough to do without sorting through a dead man's exercises." Clement had brought it home in the same case as the violin. He had, Nora thought, understood exactly what he had. He had not been able to name it, but he had known it deserved to be held by someone who would recognize it. He had known the same thing about the violin. He had made the same bet on both of them that Thomas had later made on her, that the right hands and the right circumstances would eventually find each other. Lieselot made tea while they worked and asked, after a time, whether they were finding what they had hoped for. "More than that," Dr. Reyes said. She looked at Nora. "The provenance documentation in these letters is comprehensive. The Arrighetti estate connection, the Vienna scholar, the disposition of the manuscript. Everything Clement describes is traceable. The Arrighetti family is documented in Paduan records. The Vienna copyist can almost certainly be identified through estate records from the period." She paused. "This closes every open question." Lieselot nodded as though she had known this and had been waiting for them to confirm it. "My grandfather kept these letters because he believed his students would be important," she said. "He was right about most of them, but I think Clement was the one he was most right about." Nora looked at the photograph on the shelf. The young man uncertain in front of the camera. "He didn't know it himself yet," she said. "No, they rarely do." Lieselot looked at Nora with the direct gaze of a woman who had been alive long enough to see patterns complete themselves. "You know what I thought when I first read about you? About a girl who aged out of the system with a key she didn't understand and came looking for the lock. What did you think?" "I thought Clement would have understood her immediately." Lieselot picked up her tea. "He was the same. He came to my grandfather with nothing but a willingness to learn and an instinct for what was real. He could not document his training, his work in the workshops, and the instruments he encountered during that period. In the final 3 letters, he describes preparations for his return to America and the items he is bringing with him. Ms. Vance, your grandfather's grandfather described in his own hand each instrument he carried home. He described their provenance as he understood it. He described a violin he had received as payment for restoration work from the estate of a Paduan collector named Arrighetti, with the note that the collector's family had held the instrument for 60 years and believed it to be from the Cremonese Golden Period. He described the physical characteristics of the instrument in terms that a modern reader familiar with Stradivari authentication would recognize immediately. He also described a manuscript he had been given by a scholar in Vienna who was clearing the estate of a deceased music copyist. The scholar believed the manuscript to be a student exercise. Clement believed it was something else. He wrote, in his final letter to my grandfather, that he could not say precisely what it was, but that it was too particular to be ordinary, too specific in its feeling to have been written by someone learning. He said, "It reads like a man in a hurry, like someone writing down something before it left them. I have the letters. They are yours if you want them. They document the clean acquisition of every item Clement described. They are the provenance your collection has been waiting for. I am 83 and I have no children. When I am gone, these letters will go into a box somewhere and no one will know what they are. I would rather they went to the place they belong. Please write back if you wish to discuss this. Yours sincerely, Lieselot Marchetti." Nora read the letter twice. Then she sat down because her legs had made the decision before the rest of her had. She had known, from the moment Raymond Vance mentioned Enzo Marchetti in the conference room, that documentation might exist somewhere in that training lineage. She had hoped for it with the pragmatic rather than romantic hope of someone who understood that clean provenance was the difference between a collection that operated freely and one that lived under perpetual legal cloud. She had not expected a letter from an 83-year-old woman in Austria who had been reading about them for 14 months, deciding whether to write. She called Dr. Reyes first. Nora read her the letter. There was a silence that lasted long enough to have a shape. Clement described the manuscript, Dr. Reyes said finally, in his own hand, in a letter to his teacher, in 1885 or 1886. It reads like a man in a hurry, Dr. Reyes repeated slowly, like someone writing down something before it left them. Yes. Another silence. Nora, do you understand what this means for the authentication? We are at 94%. This documentation, if the letters are what she says they are, would move that number. I know. The Vienna music copyist, that's a documented figure in the period. There were several known copyists working with composers in the late 1780s. If the estate connection can be traced. I know, Nora said again. I'm going to write back today. I want to go to Austria. Dr. Reyes made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one, the sound of a scholar encountering something that exceeded their preparation. Yes, she said. I think we should go to Austria. Nora wrote the letter by hand. It felt correct to answer in kind, to match the register of what had been offered. She wrote on the foundation's stationery, which had been designed with the same clean deliberateness she tried to bring to everything the foundation produced, and she wrote 3 paragraphs that said, "We are grateful. We would like to come to you at your convenience. Please tell us when, and we will arrange everything." She sealed it and walked it to the post office herself rather than leaving it in the outgoing mail. Some things deserve the full ceremony of intention. Lieselot Marchetti responded in 11 days, which was fast for someone who had taken 14 months to make the initial decision, and Nora understood that as a measure of how much the old woman had been waiting for the answer to come back a certain way, and how relieved she was that it had. She and Dr. Reyes flew to Vienna in November and took the train to Hallstatt, a town built into the edge of a mountain above a lake so cold and clear it looked invented. Lieselot met them at the train station in a wool coat and sensible shoes, 83 years old and small and entirely self-possessed, with eyes that assessed them both quickly and thoroughly and apparently found what they were looking for, because she smiled and said, "Good. Come, it's cold." Her house was exactly what it should have been. Stone walls, low ceilings, the accumulated weight of a long life arranged with care. Books on every surface. Photographs on the walls, old ones, showing men and women in the clothes of other decades. And among them, on a shelf by the window that overlooked the lake, a photograph Nora almost missed. 2 men, standing in what was clearly a workshop. One was older, bearded, with the bearing of a person at the center of their domain. The other was younger, dark-haired, looking at the camera with the slightly uncertain expression of someone who was not entirely comfortable being photographed. "Is that Clement?" Nora said. Lieselot looked at the photograph. "My grandfather and his American student. 1884. My grandfather wrote on the back that Clement was the most careful student he had ever taught. That he approached each. Always say why something mattered. He just knew that it did, and he was not going to be argued out of it." Nora held that for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes. Why did you wait 14 months to write?" Lieselot was quiet for a moment. Outside, the lake was steel gray in the November light. The mountains reflected in it perfectly. "Because I wanted to be sure," she said. "I have watched institutions claim things for the wrong reasons. I have watched collections broken up by people who could say the right words about heritage and stewardship and then do the wrong things with what they had been trusted with." She looked at Nora steadily. "I wanted to know whether you were going to honor what Thomas wanted, whether the foundation was real or a vehicle, whether the collection was going to be cared for or managed." And after 14 months, I had read everything written about the gallery opening. I had read the fellowship program announcement. I had read the interview you gave where you said the collection was not yours, it was everyone's, and you were only the person responsible for making sure everyone could reach it. Lieselot set down her cup. "I believe that. It is a specific thing to believe, and most people who say it do not mean it the way you meant it." "How could you tell how I meant it?" "Because you said it the way my grandfather's letters read. Like someone who is not performing. Like someone who is simply telling you the truth of what they understand." The letters came home with them on the plane, carefully packed in archival materials Dr. Reyes had brought specifically for this purpose. Each bundle separated and cushioned, the wooden box itself wrapped and labeled. They were, as Lieselot had said, Nora's if she wanted them, and she had said yes, and meant it the way she meant everything that came into the collection, with the understanding that they belonged not to her, but to the story they were part of. The provenance documentation was filed with the authentication bodies 6 weeks later. The confidence level on the Mozart manuscript moved from 94 to 98%, the remaining 2 points reserved, as the report noted, for the irreducible uncertainty inherent in any historical claim. Dr. Reyes called when the revised report was filed. 98, she said. In my field, Dr. Reyes added quietly, 98 is what certainty looks like. Nora was sitting at the kitchen table in the house on Birch Hollow Road. Outside, the birch trees were bare for winter, white in the late afternoon. The gallery was closed for the day. The house was quiet around her in the way it was quiet now, not the emptiness of abandonment, but the settled stillness of a place that knew what it was for. She thought about Clement writing in 1885 about a manuscript he could not name, but knew mattered. She thought about what it meant to be part of something longer than yourself. Not because you had been chosen for spectacular reasons, but simply because you had shown up. Because you had held on to a key you didn't understand and followed it anyway to wherever it needed to go. The story was still being written. It had been since 1882. It was being written now. Every time someone put on headphones at the listening station and heard 43 measures of something unfinished and felt, in the silence that followed, the presence of everything it had been reaching toward. She was not the end of it. She was the latest person responsible for carrying it forward, and that, she had learned, was enough. That was exactly enough. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.